All right, and we are back on the record in NDIC case number 29227, consolidated with NDIC case number 29226. It is May 9th, 2023, and the time is 9 o'clock a.m. So yesterday we did complete Hess-Bakken's initial case in chief, and it is now going to be turning over to Vitesse for their case. Before we begin, is there any housekeeping or anything we need to deal with?
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Kevin.
There's just housekeeping in terms of admissibility of stipulations and exhibits, similar to what Mr. Stahl did yesterday. I don't know if you want to take those up now or, but the parties on May 1 filed a stipulation with respect to various agreements between Hess entities and third parties like One Oak and Petro Hunt and Highland, because I understand that Hess was getting some pushback even on redactions, the redacted agreements from those third parties. So we agreed, the parties agreed that we would put together a stipulation with respect to the information that we wanted to admit, and that stipulation was presented and filed on May 1. So I just want to make sure that the commission is aware of that stipulation and accepts it.
Sure. So the stipulation is accepted. I would still have you offer, I guess, the exhibits to admit here into the hearing and make part of the record.
Yeah, well, that's the issue. We've agreed that we would pull information from those exhibits, so we wouldn't have to introduce those particular exhibits into the record. I think that's fair.
No objection to that. That's
Right.
fair.
Okay.
So the stipulation is agreed to, and then I guess anything you need to offer, maybe raise that as it occurs. But
Yeah, and then the only other housekeeping issue before Mr. Mann is like Hess, Vitesse stipulated to various of the Hess exhibits. Hess has stipulated to the admissibility of various of the Vitesse exhibits, and I'd just like to read those into the record now.
sure.
They're Exhibit E, Exhibit F, Exhibit H, Exhibit I, Exhibit N, Exhibit O, Exhibit P, Exhibit Q, Exhibit T, Exhibit U, Exhibit X, Exhibit AA, Exhibit DD, Exhibit EE, Exhibit FF, Exhibit GG, Exhibit HH, Exhibit II, and Exhibit MM, Exhibit WW, Exhibit XX, Exhibit YY, Exhibit ZZ, Exhibit AAA, Exhibit BBB, and Exhibit CCC.
Pull up some of these. And so these are being offered right now to be admitted, and
Yes,
and no
pursuant to
objection.
stipulation.
No objection to admission of the stipulated exhibits.
So the stipulated exhibits are all admitted.
That's it for me.
Mr. Examiner, I just had one brief issue to touch on,
Sure.
Housekeeping matter. Yesterday, Mr. Hicks had asked Mr. Gatling about Hess's return on capital in the tariff model, and Mr. Gatling had explained that that rate is confidential, and therefore he couldn't discuss that during the hearing. To be clear, Mr. Examiner, although the rate is confidential, documents showing the rate have been produced to Vitesse in this case as attorney's eyes only, pursuant to the protective order in the case. And they've also disclosed that to the applicants in the Sinclair case, which is currently set for a merits hearing to be heard next month. We expect the rate to be discussed at that hearing on the merits next month, and Mr. Examiner will work with you to identify an appropriate way to address the confidentiality concerns associated and relating to that rate of return and any other pricing information.
All right, I appreciate that. So I guess anything, and I guess I don't know if we necessarily need that in this phase of this case. I guess, Mr. Hicks, what are your, did you?
No.
Yeah, so, but we can address that as that goes forward. So I guess anything further before we begin with Vitesse's case?
Nothing for Vitesse.
No, Mr. Examiner, thank you.
All right, Mr. Evans?
Vitesse would call Brian Cree.
Brian Creed. Mr. Crete, please take a seat and make sure your mic is on. All right, raise your right hand. You solemnly swear or affirm under the penalties of perjury that the testimony you're about to give in this matter will be true and correct to the best of your knowledge and belief.
I do.
Mr. Crete, could you state your full name and spell your last name, please?
My name is Brian Cree. Last name is C-R-E-E.
His mic is not on.
It was on.
Go ahead.
That again?
Yes.
All right. My name is Brian Cree. Last name is C-R-E-E.
And your age, Mr. Crete?
I turned 60 earlier this month.
Welcome to the club. Can you just briefly explain your educational experience?
Sure. I received a bachelor degree in 1985 from the University of Northern Iowa, and then sat for and passed the CPA exam shortly thereafter.
And you've been involved in the oil and gas industry, fair to say?
Yeah, I started in public accounting in 1987 with Deloitte in Denver. Most of the clients that I was engaged in were oil and gas companies, so I got kind of thrown into the fire of the oil and gas industry at that time.
And walk us through, after your experience in the accounting industry, who did you go to work for, and then just take us through to current day. And while you're doing that, can you just explain your positions with those companies?
Sure. Hopefully not bore everyone, but
You know what? Let me take this from you.
Okay.
You shouldn't be having notes while you're testifying.
oh, sorry.
That's all right. I would prefer you not have notes. Some people view it differently. I like the witness to testify from
Great.
memory.
So I joined the predecessor of a company called Garrity Oil and Gas Corporation late in 1987 as their controller. That company went public in 1990 as Garrity Oil and Gas Corporation. During that period from kind of late 1987 until 1996, I was with Garrity Oil and Gas, held various different positions. Again, started out as the controller, became the CFO, then was senior vice president of operations, and was also a director of the company during that point in time.
Did you, let me stop you before you move on. Garrity, can you give us a little idea of what Garrity was? I mean, was that a company involved in actually drilling and operating wells?
It was, yeah. Garrity Oil and Gas was a very active operator. In fact, I think it was one of the most active operators in the United States in the early 1990s. At one point in time, we were running 19 drilling rigs, completing a lot of uphole zones. I think we had over 500 completions a year for a few years. Again, it was in the DJ Basin. We weren't drilling horizontal wells at that point in time. They were just vertical wells, but we were very active as an operator.
And at some point, did you leave Garrity and join Patina?
Yeah, in '96, Garrity Oil and Gas and Snyder Oil Corporation merged to form Patina Oil and Gas, and I was with Patina until 1999. In roles as their chief operating officer and executive vice president, also a director of that company.
Was Patina involved in drilling and operating?
It was. It continued to do what Garrity Oil and Gas and Snyder had done in the DJ Basin, continued to drill and refrac wells and just perform operations.
And where did you go to after Patina?
So after a couple of years of taking some time off to be with my kids, I went to work in a different industry, a molecular memory technology company, where I was the chief financial officer and chief operating officer from roughly 2001 until 2006.
In 2006, where did you go?
So then I left and went to a company called Luca Technologies. It was a company that was in the oil and gas industry, a little bit different. It was coal bed methane. The idea was to use technology to stimulate organisms that would help convert coal to natural gas, and was with them from 2007 until 2012. We tried to take that company public. Gas prices didn't cooperate, and that company and eventually shut down and sold its technology to other companies.
And what was your position at Luca again?
So I was the Chief Financial Officer and Chief Operating Officer of Luca Technologies.
And after you left Luca, is that when you joined Vitesse?
It was. So I joined Vitesse in 2013.
Let me, before we get into Vitesse, let me ask you about your experience on the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission. What is that organization?
So the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission is very similar to the North Dakota Industrial Commission in that it regulates drilling and production of oil and gas activity in the state of Colorado.
And you served on that commission?
I did. I was appointed by Governor Owens in 1999 as one of the 7 commissioners. For most of the time, I was the vice chairman, presiding over, monthly commission hearings. It's a volunteer position. It's not something you get paid for. But yeah, I was involved from 1999 until Governor Ritter came in the mid-2000s, and at that point in time, the commission was kind of changing. The mission was changing. I liked the mission that we have here at the NDIC, which is to promote the development. But in Colorado, they started to change the mission a little bit.
Are you aware during your time and service on the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission, did the commission ever exercise jurisdiction over issues involving post-production costs, do you know?
Objection, it's irrelevant what happens in Colorado.
It relates to his further testimony to come.
I'm going to allow the testimony, so overruled, but objection is noted.
Can you re-ask the question?
Sure. During your service on the commission, the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission, did the commission ever exercise jurisdiction over issues involving post-production costs?
Not to my knowledge.
During your service on the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission, did the commission ever say that a post-production cost was a cost to operate a well?
No.
All right. So let's jump to Vitesse. I think you said you joined Vitesse in 2013, is that right?
I did.
Describe the business of Vitesse, if you would.
So Vitesse is a non-operated working interest owner in wells. We also have overriding royalty interests in wells, predominantly in North Dakota. We also own some assets in Colorado and the Powder River Basin. Vitesse was a private company, became a public company earlier this year in January. We have interests in approximately 6,500 wells in North Dakota. A small working interest, anywhere from an average working interest of just under 3%, but we have interest in wells that are even closer to 50% working interest in some wells, and then a lot of smaller wells. But in addition to the producing wells, we have about 800 wells that are kind of being developed at this point in time. So we have a pretty good footprint in North Dakota. It's a company that again is focused on non-op, and really kind of the key for us is that the way we built the company was not through buying proved developed producing wells. We typically tried to focus on buying undeveloped wells that would allow us to convert those into producing wells. That was really the main thesis of the company when it started back in 2013. Was we wanted to be a good partner to operators. We wanted to make sure that we had development opportunities with the highest quality operators in North Dakota, and could work with them to see wells get developed and technology improve. And I think we've spent probably $500 million drilling and completing wells since 2013.
So fair to say Vitesse doesn't operate any wells in North Dakota?
We do not operate any wells in North Dakota.
There was some testimony yesterday, and there's been a lot made in Vitesse's briefs, which we'll pre-hearing brief, which we'll get into when I ask you some questions about that in a bit, about the fact that Vitesse takes its production in kind from wells in North Dakota. Does Vitesse, or the fact that it doesn't take its production in kind, does Vitesse take any production in kind in North Dakota?
We do not. We looked at trying to take production in kind back in probably 2016 and 17. We were just really questioning whether or not some of the amounts that we were being paid and some of the costs that we were being charged were reasonable. And so we spent a lot of time working with various other companies, other non-operated working interest companies, trying to figure out if it was feasible, economic, to take our production in kind. And you know, after a lot of investigation and talking to a lot of people, it just didn't seem like it was economically feasible, nor did the operators really want us to. It was just going to complicate matters. And so we kind of gave up on that idea, even though we would have loved to have kind of been in control of our oil and gas production. But it just didn't work out. And to my knowledge, none of the other operators none of the other non-operated working interest owners that I know of take their production in kind.
What is Vitesse's average interest as a non-op in wells in North Dakota? Do you know that?
Just under 3% on average across the 6,500 producing wells that we have.
So you touched on this a bit earlier, but what prompted the lawsuit that Vitesse filed against Hess and resulted in our presence here today before the commission?
So in 2018, prior to 2018, we didn't have a lot of wells, ownership in wells that Hess operated. In 2018, we made a pretty sizable acquisition for us, and that came with 500-600 wells operated by Hess. And during that, you know, after the acquisition, obviously, you have to go through an assignment, and Hess had to work on their assignment to change the ownership from the prior company to us. And for a period of, you know, a little over a year from the time that they started that assignment, they put those wells in suspense, and we don't get, you know, paid revenues during that period of time while those wells are in suspense. And that forces us to accrue production, you know, based off of the information that's available on the North Dakota Industrial Commission site. We have to estimate revenues, costs, and whatnot. And so we go through that. And then I think it was around March of 2020, all the assignments were finally processed, and we started to get paid revenue. And when we got those revenue checks, what we noticed is that they were significantly below what we had accrued. They were millions of dollars short from what we expected to receive. And so we started to really look into it. And what we found was that the net revenues, whether it be through the transportation costs or compression costs, were 3 to 4 times higher than what we were seeing across the average of all the rest of our operators. And so that really got us interested in, like, what's going on here? Why are these costs so much higher than we expected? And what's going on? And so we did a lot of analysis and tried to work with Hess, tried to get answers to those questions. We really didn't get any answers that were satisfactory to us, and so we filed the lawsuit at the end of 2020.
Okay. You have exhibit binders here. In the first volume, this is volume 2, there should be a volume 1 over there in the white binders. There's an exhibit I. This is one of those exhibits that's been stipulated to.
Okay.
Are you familiar with exhibit I? That spreadsheet that's attached after the first page?
I am.
And can you explain to us what exhibit I is?
So Exhibit I appears to be a list of all of the wells that Vitesse has either a working interest in or an overriding royalty interest in that are operated by Hess.
Okay. And why was that spreadsheet prepared?
Well, when you're a non-operated working interest owner and you have to rely on information from the NDIC and whatnot, it's, you know, you need to make sure that you have a really good understanding of what you own and who operates it and whatnot. So this is just part of information that we keep as part of our accounting and operational activity.
You mentioned a few moments ago, this has been stipulated too, so we don't need to go through the, you know, the song and dance of foundation and all of that. So, you mentioned a few moments ago other operators that Vitesse has worked with in North Dakota. Can you just give us an idea of some of those other operators?
Sure. We have interests in wells operated by 30-plus different operators in North Dakota and Montana. The largest operators are, obviously Hess is one of our largest operators now. Continental, Grayson Mill, Marathon, Cord, EOG, those are kind of some of the larger operators. But again, we have interests with over 30-plus operators. So we have a lot of information about what goes on a day-to-day basis, and whether that's drilling and completion activity, AFE information, refracs. We get a lot of information from those operators that allow us to analyze, you know, our business.
And some of that information includes revenue statements, right?
It does.
Okay. On which reductions for processing and transportation and compression and things of that nature are shown, right?
Yes.
Okay. You mentioned your experience in the oil and gas industry. Fair to say you've been involved in it for many years,
I have 30-plus years.
including at Garrity and Patina, oversight or involvement in drilling and operation, or at least review of drilling and operation records and information, right?
Yes.
What does production of oil and gas mean to you?
Production of oil and gas to me means the activity of bringing the oil and gas to the surface.
Yeah, B, but you don't need to turn around. I'm going to ask you to take a look at Exhibit B in the binder. No, that's okay. It's in your binder.
Okay.
And Exhibit B is NDCC 380808, and I want to focus on subsection 2 on that page. Fair to say you're familiar with that statute?
I am.
Okay. And do you see where this statute talks about proper costs?
Yes.
And it talks about the commission oversight of costs for drilling and operation of a well on the spacing unit. Do you see that?
Yes.
Okay. What does operation of a well on the spacing unit mean to you?
The operation would be you know, since it's drilling and operation, I would say the drilling is anything related to capital costs associated with the drilling completion, getting a well to the point where it can start to produce. And then operate would be the lease operating expenses associated with getting that oil and gas out of the ground and to a sales point.
And you see that the section also refers to supervision of drilling and operation of a well cost. You see that?
I do.
What to you does supervision mean?
Well, to me, you know, under accounting regulations, COPUS, that kind of dictates what companies, what operators can charge other working interest owners. There's always a provision that allows for supervision. Sometimes that can be third-party supervision, but a lot of times that gives the operator the ability to charge costs to a well for their own internal staff, because those people are supervising what's going on out in the field and those activities.
Okay. aside from Hess-Bakken, and I'm going to, when I say Hess-Bakken, I mean Hess-Bakken Investments 2 LLC.
Okay.
So aside from Hess-Bakken, has any of the other operators that Vitesse has worked with in North Dakota ever taken the position with Vitesse that a post-production cost was a cost to operate a well on a spacing unit?
No.
Aside from Hess-Bakken, has any other operator in North Dakota ever taken the position with Vitesse that a post-production cost was a cost incurred in connection with drilling a well on the spacing unit?
No.
And aside from Hess-Bakken, has any other operator that Vitesse has worked with in North Dakota ever taken the position with Vitesse that a post-production cost was a cost incurred to supervise the drilling or operation of a well on the spacing unit?
No.
I want to switch gears here for a bit and talk about a couple of Hess exhibits that there's been much ado made of, both in the pre-hearing brief and in opening statement. So for this, I'm going to ask you to take a look at those black exhibit binders that are sitting there. And I'm going to ask you to look at volume 2. That's that one. And I'm going to ask you to go to exhibit 31, HX031.
Okay.
And I just closed out my electronic file here, so you got to bear with me while I open it up. The commission needs a bit of time to find it as well. Are you familiar with Exhibit 31, Hess Exhibit 31?
I am.
Okay, can you explain to us what that is?
This is our earnings release for the full year of 2022. It's the first earnings release we did as a new public company.
And if I can get you to turn to page 2.
Yes.
There's a heading section there called Financial and Operating Results. Do you see that?
I do.
Okay, and then if you can go to the next to last paragraph, the one that begins Production Expenses, you see that?
Yes.
Okay, and it says production expenses in 2022, including gathering and transportation, were 49.3 million, and then it provides some additional information. You see that?
I do.
Okay. And then, with that in mind, can you turn to page 4?
Okay.
And you see there's certain financial and operating data for 2021 and 2022 presented.
Yes.
There's a revenue line item. Do you see that?
Yes.
Then there's an operating expenses line item. Do you see that?
Yeah, they're kind of headings.
Headings, okay. And
not
under,
necessarily line items.
yeah, underneath those headings, there's a line item, right, called production? Or
Yes.
subline. Okay, and then the last entry I want to show you before I ask you questions on this is on page 7.
Okay.
Once again, some additional financial information presented. This looks like to be a consolidated statement of operations, right?
Yes, it does.
For 2022 and 2021.
Yes.
And there's a heading called revenue, right?
There is.
And a heading called operating expenses.
Yes.
And then underneath operating expenses, you see the production expense line?
I do.
All right. So let's go back and talk about the entry on page 2, which gets reflected in these financial statements we just looked at, where it says production expenses in 2022, including gathering and transportation. Why did Vitesse include gathering and transportation in that particular discussion?
So historically, when Vitesse was a private company, And of course, all companies kind of do this, is you have different account classifications that you record expenses and capital costs and whatnot. We're talking about operating expenses here, or costs to run a company. We would always show gathering and transportation as a separate line item from lease operating expenses, production taxes, G&A, other types of expenses. During the process of going public, our auditors, the attorneys, just felt like it would be better to go ahead and include both the costs of gathering and transportation and lease operating expenses in one accounting classification called production. That's a lot of companies do that. Some companies also keep them separate. And so from our purposes, the reason that we wanted to highlight in our release that this line item, this accounting classification for production, we wanted to make sure that the public and analysts and everyone understood that it included gathering and transportation expense in addition to just lease operating expenses.
In accounting for in putting the gathering and transportation expenses in that accounting classification, did Vitesse intend to suggest that those fees were costs incurred to operate a well on a spacing unit?
No, there's no correlation between what we do in our accounting financial statements and what would be something that would be under a statute in North Dakota. There's no correlation whatsoever. It's just the way accountants, every expense needs to show up on your income statement. It either needs to be netted out of oil and gas revenue, which some operators do that with us. When they send us revenue checks, some of them will net it out of oil and gas revenue, and we don't really get the detail that allows us to record those costs as gathering and transportation or anything else. So everything needs to be on the income statement. It needs to either be netted out of revenue or in an expense item. And you have to account for everything that comes through to record proper financial statements.
I want to talk about another one of these documents that Hess has made a big deal about. You're familiar with 10Ks, right?
I am.
Okay. Can you turn to HX 35?
Okay.
All right, and those of us who have dealt with 10Ks with some degree of regularity know that the printing on these things are a little bit difficult, but if you turn to page 55, and actually page 55 is a page number at the top of a page, and I'm going to refer you to the page right before that, which is still 55.
They do not print very well, do they?
No, they never do.
Okay, I think I'm there.
Okay. Do you see on page 55, there is a heading called Principal Components of Our Cost Structure?
Yes.
And then third down from that, there is a subsection called Production Expenses. Do you see that?
I do.
And it says production expenses are costs incurred to bring oil and natural gas out of the ground and to market, together with the cost incurred to maintain our producing properties. Such costs include field personnel compensation, saltwater disposal, utilities, maintenance, repairs, and servicing expenses related to our oil and natural gas properties. Do you see that?
I do.
All right. Why did Vitesse, in that particular subsection, reference costs of bringing oil and natural gas to market under the description of production expenses?
Again, as I explained earlier, the decision was made to combine lease operating expenses and gathering and transportation into an accounting classification called production expenses. And so here, to make sure that we are being very clear to investors, to readers of these financial statements, to our analysts, we want to make sure that they all understand what is included in that category. And so typically people, I think, would think that a production expense would just be lease operating expenses. But because we were including gathering and transportation in there, we wanted to make it very clear that this included both lease operating and gathering and transportation, which gathering and transportation are costs associated with bringing, oil and gas to market.
Hey, as someone who's been a CFO of companies and former CPA, practicing CPA, are you aware of any accounting requirement to in the oil and gas sector to break out post-production and production expenses and report them separately?
No, there's no, accounting doesn't go into post-production or production. What you're supposed to do is try to give your readers of financial statements enough information so they can understand what is in each category, however you decide to categorize those.
And the last one, because I really don't want to make much ado about this, but I think I have to at least address this since it was addressed in briefing and opening statement. If you would turn to page 63. This actually has the page number at the bottom.
Okay, I'm there.
Okay, and you see the first section at the top called production expense.
Yes.
All right. And this talks about an increase in 2021 over 2022, and it says was primarily related to higher expense related to workovers and higher costs related to added natural gas gathering and processing infrastructure due to increased regulation regarding capturing natural gas. Do you see that?
I do.
Why did Vitesse say that under production expense?
So again, because we're including gathering and transportation expense in this production accounting classification category, what we were seeing is as infrastructure was being built, we were seeing our gathering and transportation expenses increasing. We don't, as a non-operated working interest owner, we're not privy to contracts between the operator and whether it's midstream companies or affiliated companies through integration like Hess does. We're not privy to those contracts, so we don't know exactly whether they're percentage of proceeds contracts or whether they're any type of just service fee. The way we see it is it's just through an expense. It's through gathering and transportation expense. So when infrastructure goes up, we're assuming that midstream companies had to go out and incur a bunch of costs, and they're probably charging higher costs back to the operators, which then get passed along to us. And so we wanted to make sure that again, the readers of our financial statements understood variances between quarters as it related, or I guess in this situation it was a year-to-year comparison, as this is as part of management's discussion and analysis of financial and operating results. We wanted to make it very clear why we were seeing differences in costs between years.
And are you aware of any obligation in the accounting literature, accounting pronouncements, accounting guidance that requires a company in the oil and gas industry in their 10Ks to break out production and post-production costs?
No, absolutely not. In fact, from our standpoint, some of these gathering and transportation costs do get netted out of revenue. Others get recorded into an expense category. We've had conversations with Deloitte, who is our external auditor, and they've opined on the fact that it doesn't
here.
matter which way.
He's testifying as to hearsay.
I'll move on. Hess has filed, in this case, a pre-hearing brief last Wednesday. Did you read that?
I did.
Okay. I want to ask you about a couple of the comments that were made in that pre-hearing brief and get your reaction. And I'll just quote them for you, and I'll give you the paragraph so everybody knows where I'm quoting from. But Hess Bakken says in paragraph 8 of that pre-hearing brief, quote, Vitesse has washed its hands of the significant risks and burdens of the production and marketing chain. Remember reading that?
I do.
What's your reaction when you read that?
Well, I was an operator for a long time, and so I understand, I had marketing reporting to me, and So I was a little confused by it because, look, we obviously rely on operators. We try to select the best operators to work with. And we know that they have jobs to do, and they have work to do, and that there are risks, in this industry. I'm not sure I understand exactly what the risks are of marketing. I know that there's challenges and there's whatnot, and again, I think we get charged for those type of costs. But from my perspective, I also look at it, and again, back to the taking oil and gas in kind. From everything that I understand and know, obviously, when you have a commodity that you are selling, economies of scale, sometimes get you better deals, better prices. And the fact that operators get to take non-operated working interest owner and royalty owner oil and gas and sell them as part of their own process should, in theory, allow everyone to get a higher price because it's more economies of scale. So I kind of looked at that and I didn't really understand the statement about washing our hands, because again, we appreciate everything that they do, and would hope that their ability to market our gas and oil at the same time would actually be beneficial to all of us.
And what does that, to your understanding, what does that statement have anything to do with whether the North Dakota legislature gave the commission jurisdiction over post-production services and costs?
I didn't see how it was relative.
All right. Another one of these statements that Hess makes in paragraph 8 is that Vitesse, quote, relies on Hess-Bakken, quote, to take all of the risks, close quote. Remember reading that?
I do.
And what was your reaction to that statement?
Again, I don't know what they're referring to with all of the risk. And I think in any risks that they're taking and that they mitigate, I'm sure they mitigate those risks by having processes and procedures and things in place because they're a good operator. Those costs get passed along to us either through supervision or however.
And the final comment in paragraph 8, which seems to be where all of these sensational comments are made, says, quote, Vitesse then waits in the wings and challenges Hess-Bakken's operational decisions after the fact. You remember reading that?
I do.
What's your reaction to that?
That one was a little tough because, again, I don't think we sit back and wait in the wings. And the reality is that, again, we want to be a great partner to all of our operators. And in this situation, what we saw were costs being charged to us by Hess, a company that's fully integrated. You would expect full integration between, all their drilling and completion, that Mr. Gatling talked about yesterday. It's all music to our ears in terms of it's most efficient way to do it. What we're just confused by is why that full integration would cause Hess to be charging us costs, all-in costs for these post-production costs that are, again, 2, 3, 4 times more than the average of all the rest of our operators. You would think it would be just the opposite.
All right, I'm going to ask you to take a look at Exhibit NN in the white exhibit books.
So volume 2 maybe?
Probably 2.
Okay. Okay,
Are you there?
I am.
All right. Are you familiar with joint interest billing statements?
Yes, I am.
By the way, on a typical jib, they're referred to as jibs, right?
They are.
On a typical, how big is a typical jib? How many pages?
Some jibs could be thousands of pages. I mean, it just depends on obviously how many wells you own that are operated by that specific operator. So with Hess, I would imagine that our jibs on a monthly basis are, a lot of pages.
And what's the purpose of a jib?
So it's again, it's a joint interest billing statement. Typically, it's broken down by well, and it's where the operator charges us lease operating expenses. It can also include, drilling and completion costs. So it's both capital and operating expenses, are billed to a non-operated working interest owner for costs associated with each of the wells.
And are the jibs in Exhibit NN, by the way, you've looked at these pages before your testimony here today, is it fair to say?
That is fair.
Okay. And are these pages in Exhibit NN from jibs issued by Hessbach and to Vitesse?
Yes, it looks like they're for the operational accounting month of April 2020. So we get these every single month, sometimes, more than one a month, depending on how the operator bills us. But, yeah.
Okay, well, page through there, because you're going to see different months involved. We took pages from.
Oh, okay.
So these are for several months, fair to say?
Yeah, then we see March of 22, April of 22. Yeah, so there's several different months here, and but they all appear to be joint interest billing statements from Hess.
Yeah, okay. And the reason why I asked you to do that is because I need to move to admit this exhibit into evidence since Hess refused to stipulate. We could have filled the room with thousands of pages of jibs if we wanted to, but we took representative pages from the beginning of each jib as this exhibit. So I'm moving to, Vitesse moves to admit Exhibit NN.
Any objection?
Just with the note that this is a Intergelink document and not a document specifically from Hess. No objection with that qualification.
Exhibit NN is admitted.
So you mentioned that you reviewed these pages in Exhibit NN before your testimony here today. Did you see any post-production costs listed on any of those pages from jibs?
No, I didn't. Post-production costs are always deducted from revenue on a revenue statement. They're never included on a joint interest billing, to my knowledge, that I've ever seen.
Okay. Are you aware of whether Hess-Bakken has ever included post-production costs on any jib statement issued to Vitesse?
Not that I have ever seen.
Let's stay with that particular binder and just turn to the exhibit immediately preceding it, MM.
Okay?
All right. Give me 1 second, if you would. Okay. So MM has been stipulated to. So I just want to ask you if you're familiar with documents called authorizations for expenditures.
I am. I see hundreds of these a year, fortunately, because of our interests in North Dakota.
Sometimes referred to as AFEs.
Yes.
All right. What's the purpose of an AFE?
So an AFE is a document that is provided to non-operated working interest owners by operators when they intend to drill and complete a well. And so any time that an operator decides that they want to drill a well on a drilling and spacing unit, they're required to provide the non-operated working interest owner with this AFE. The AFE, most of the time will spell out what their intention is, where they plan to drill the well, how they plan to drill the well, and the expected costs associated with that well. And then the non-operated working interest owner has 30 days from which to elect whether or not they would like to consent or non-consent their interest associated with the drilling of that well.
I'll be a little more precise on this question than I was with the jibs. You see that the first page of this is actually on Hess letterhead.
Yes,
So these were these AFEs, and you reviewed these documents prior to your testimony here today, right?
I did.
Exhibit MM. Were these AFEs issued by Hess to Vitesse?
Yeah, most of these AFEs are from Hess. All of them are from Hess. Most of them are to Vitesse Energy. I see the second one in here is actually addressed to Marathon Oil Company. A lot of times what Vitesse does is we will acquire interests from other companies. In this situation, probably Marathon chose to sell the AFE that they would have received from Hess, and we were the likely buyer of that AFE. But I think all the rest of them that I saw in here were addressed directly to Vitesse Energy because that we were the owner of the interest. I guess maybe there's one in here also that was Oasis Petroleum. Same situation. We're likely to have acquired that interest from Oasis, but it is issued to them from Hess.
Okay. And again, you reviewed these prior to testifying here today. Did you see any post-production costs referenced on any of these AFEs?
Now, an authorization for expenditure is going to deal with drilling and completion costs. It's not going to have any cost to produce the well or post-production costs.
And are you aware of whether Hess Bakken has ever included post-production costs on any AFE issued to Vitesse?
Again, not that I have ever seen.
All right. And the final exhibit I want to direct your attention to is Exhibit 00.
Okay.
All right, and you reviewed Exhibit 00 prior to testifying here today?
I did.
Okay. And what are the pages in Exhibit 00?
So these are revenue statements from Hess, I guess through EnergyLink, that you have various different examples. The first one is from March of 2023. I guess the second one is also March of 2023, May of 2021. So these are all different revenue statements associated with, they appear to be just interests, royalty interests. There doesn't appear to be any working interest revenue statements here. These are all royalty interest revenue statements.
Right, and I want to confirm that just by walking through this exhibit with you, but first I have to ask, you see the operator up there, it says Hess Bakken Investments 2 LLC,
I do.
and you see the owner being Vitesse Energy LLC, at least on the first page?
I do.
Okay, and so were these revenue statements issued by Hess Bakken to Vitesse?
Yes.
All right, through, as you qualified. Again, I have to move to admit these since they were not stipulated to by Hess Bakken.
Any objection?
Again, same qualification, so long as it's not looked at as a proper Hess document, no objection. Sure.
Exhibit 00 is admitted.
Now, let's take a look at the first page of Exhibit 00. This is March 25 of 2023. Again, the operator is Hess Bakken Investments 2 LLC. Do you see the underneath the in the chart underneath that it says gas? You see the box that says gas,
Yes,
20 R, and it says royalty interest. Do you see that?
I do.
And then you see the oil box, 10 R. You see that? It
Yes.
says royalty interest, right?
Yes.
And then plant products, 30 R, again royalty interest.
Yes.
Does that mean it's a mineral interest, or is that an overriding royalty interest?
Assuming that's an overriding royalty interest for, it looks like the BW Heidi well. And so they're allocating revenues and costs to each of the different products, gas, oil, and NGLs, plant products.
What was this a royalty interest to Vitesse or an overriding royalty interest?
I'm not sure if it's a royalty interest or an overriding royalty interest, but it's a non-cost bearing interest.
Okay. And you see transportation, processing, and compression noted there?
I do, along with production tax.
Yeah, but transportation, processing, compression, is it, based upon your previous testimony, fair to say you characterize those as post-production costs?
We do. Those are costs that are being deducted from our share of revenue on this revenue statement.
Does Vitesse look at those as, or consider those to be cost to operate a well on a spacing unit?
No.
You've, no, strike that. Does Vitesse have oil and gas leases with Hess Bakken with respect to the wells referenced in Exhibit 00?
Yes.
And prior to testifying here today, did you familiarize yourself with those leases? For
Yeah, I've-
these particular wells?
Yeah, I'm not a land person, but yeah, I generally looked at those leases.
Okay. Did you look at the royalty provisions in those leases?
I did.
Okay. And when did you do that? When did you last look at those?
Sometime within the last 2 to 3 weeks.
And based upon your review of those provisions, is Vitesse responsible under the royalty provisions of those leases to pay for any of the costs related to the drilling or operation of wells?
I'm going to object to the question on best evidence grounds as well as it's calling for a legal conclusion of an interpretation of a royalty clause.
I'm asking for his interpretation. I'm not asking for an expert opinion. You read them.
Doesn't matter.
Yeah.
The objection is noted. I will allow him to provide his, I guess, to his knowledge and what he understands that interpretation.
So will you ask the question?
Sure.
again?
Let me ask it again. To your understanding, did those royalty provisions that you read in the leases associated with the revenue statements reflected in Exhibit 00, did those royalty provisions require Vitesse to pay any of the costs related to the drilling or operation of wells on a spacing unit?
No.
Are you familiar with the position that Hess Bakken is taking in this proceeding regarding jurisdiction of the Commission over Post-Production Costs?
I am.
What's your understanding?
My understanding is that Hess's position is that post-production costs, costs that occur off the lease, that are downstream of a custody transfer point, which I think everyone has been referring to as post-production costs, that those are a cost to operate a well on a spacing unit.
And you understand those costs in dispute to include things like, those post-production costs in dispute to include things like gathering, compression, transportation, processing, things of that nature?
Yeah, they include all of those costs that were talked about yesterday, dehydrating, whatnot, that are, included somewhere in one of these categories of transportation, processing, compression.
Okay. And based upon your review of the leases and the revenue statements that you get from Hess, if those post-production costs truly are costs to operate a well on a spacing unit, would you expect to see any of those costs deducted from Vitesse's royalty payments?
No, if they were truly a cost to operate a well under leases, in my interpretation would be that those should not be deducted from a royalty owner's revenue if they're not truly post-production costs.
Okay. No further questions at this time.
Cross-examination.
Morning, Mr. Cree.
Morning.
My name is DJ Beatty. We haven't met before, have we?
We have not.
Yeah, well, great.
Not had the pleasure.
Yeah, that's, it's never been said before. All right, one quick question, or a couple of quick questions to follow up on what you're saying about the leases that Vitesse has with Hess Bakken. Just to be clear, you're not an expert on oil and gas leases, right?
I am not.
Are you familiar with the broad body of royalty case law that addresses how to construe and apply the terms of royalty provisions in oil and gas leases?
I have some general understanding, but nothing in depth.
Okay, in terms of North Dakota case law concerning those issues, are you familiar with any of it?
No.
Okay. Exhibit O was just up behind us, and it disappeared.
Double O?
Oh,
Double O. Yeah, is it still in front of you by chance?
yes, it is.
Okay, could you look up at the top right-hand corner of that revenue statement?
Okay,
And you see that there's some check information there?
yes.
Okay, and then there's a check date. What is that check date?
On the first page, the check date is March 25, 2023.
Okay, and what is the check amount on that date?
It appears to be 933,000 roughly dollars.
Okay, so in March of 2023, Hess paid Vitesse nearly $1 million, right?
Yes.
A lot of money. Agreed?
Yes.
Okay. And would you agree with me that revenue statements or check stubs that come directly from Hess to Vitesse look different than this document?
I don't see the actual checks that come from Hess.
Okay, so you don't have that information, you don't review that information, is that fair?
I do not.
Okay. Now, the $933,000 that Hess paid to Vitesse for this month, was that all associated with Vitesse's royalty interest, or was that working interest and royalty interest?
I would imagine that that included both working interest and royalty interest.
Okay, and generally, what proportion of the payments from Hess to Vitesse on a monthly basis is attributable to working interest versus royalty interest revenue?
I don't know that I could tell you exactly what that percentage is for Hess as one of our operators. I could tell you that on an overall basis, Vitesse generates roughly 90-some% of its oil and gas revenue as a working interest owner as compared to a royalty owner.
Okay. All right, going back to the beginning of your testimony, kind of at the start, you told us about who Vitesse is, what it owns, those sorts of things. Do you recall that?
Yes, sir.
And I think you said something along the lines of that Vitesse owned working interest in roughly 6,500 wells, if I wrote it down correctly, in the Williston Basin. Is that right?
Approximately, yes.
Okay, and those working interests in the Williston Basin, you'd agree that those are Vitesse's primary assets. It's its core assets.
It is its core assets. I would say that roughly 90% of Vitesse's assets reside in North Dakota and Montana.
Got it. And how many of those 6,500 wells are at issue in this case?
I believe it's somewhere around 850, maybe closer to 900 wells.
Okay, so yeah, we can talk in rough terms. I'm not trying to stick you with a specific number there. Now, let's go back. You provided a couple of sworn statements, verifications, those sorts of things throughout the course of this lawsuit, haven't you?
Yes.
And do you recall stating under oath in an affidavit provided back to the district court in 2021 that of the 800, 900 wells that are at issue in this case, that Vitesse has a royalty interest in only 2.6% of those wells?
Yes.
Okay, so that would mean, my lawyer math's going to be bad, 97.4% of the wells at issue in the case are strictly working interest, right?
That is correct.
Okay, and of that 2.6% of wells that Vitesse has royalty interest in, some of those wells Vitesse also owns a separate working interest, right?
So can you say that again?
Absolutely. So the 2.6% of wells that you previously testified were wells where Vitesse owned a royalty interest. Okay, that's the group I'm talking about. You with me so far?
Yes.
Okay, there is a portion of that 2.6% where Vitesse owns royalty interest and working interest, correct?
I don't believe so. I believe that the 2.6% represents only wells that Vitesse owns a royalty interest in. Now, there are some of the working interest wells. Not only do we have our direct net revenue interest associated with the working interest, but we may also include a royalty interest in.
Okay,
over and above just the net revenue interest for the working interest. But I think the 2.6%, we're now talking about a year and a half, 2 years ago. But I believe that was just listing the wells that we only owned a royalty interest in.
okay, Mr. Cree, if you took a look at your affidavit, do you think that would refresh your recollection?
It might help.
Okay, Mr. Hearing Examiner, may I pass his affidavit to him to refresh his recollection?
Any objection to?
No, I'd just like to see it first.
Yeah,
but-
absolutely, it's on its way.
Yeah, no objection.
Okay.
Okay, now, Mr. Cree, now that you've reviewed your affidavit from a couple of years ago, can you identify for us what percentage of wells at issue in this case are wells in which Vitesse only owns a royalty interest?
It looks like from the affidavit here, it would appear to me that we're saying that the wells that we only have a royalty interest in represent about 1.4% of the wells, and that we have a royalty interest and a working interest in an additional 1.2% of the wells.
Okay, and I'm sure when you prepared that affidavit a few years ago that you researched the issues, that everything in there is true and correct?
Yes.
Okay. And so you would agree with me that in the overwhelming majority of the wells that are at issue here, the overwhelming majority, that Vitesse holds working interest, correct?
Yes.
And you'd agree with me what this case is really about is Vitesse's situation as a non-operated working interest in wells owned and operated by Hess Bakken, right?
Yes.
All right, going back to some of your testimony earlier today, I think you said that Vitesse doesn't operate any wells, right?
We do not.
And also, just going back to your past in the oil and gas business that you walked through with Mr. Evans, what was the last company that you worked with that actually drilled and operated wells?
That would have been Patina Oil and Gas.
And your employment with Patina ended in 1999, if I remember correctly?
It did.
Okay, and that was, I assume that those wells were conventional wells?
They were conventional wells. They
Were there-
vertical wells.
Oh, I'm sorry to interrupt you there.
They were conventional vertical wells.
Okay. And remind me, were any of those wells in North Dakota?
They were not.
Okay, the non-operated nature of Vitesse's business, that's an intentional decision, right?
Yes.
And because it has chosen to be a non-operator, Vitesse depends wholly on its operators to propose, permit, drill, and complete wells, right?
Yes.
And just like it relies on its operators for those activities, Vitesse also wholly depends on its operators, once the wells are online, to continue producing those wells, correct?
Yes.
Another part of Vitesse's business model that you mentioned a minute ago was to spread out capital and operational risk across your assets by intentionally holding smaller interest in a larger number of wells. Do you remember that?
I don't remember saying that, but that's accurate.
Okay, so it's a fair statement nonetheless?
Yes, I think that's a diversification of risk to have a small working interest across a large number of operators.
Okay, and there's obviously some benefits to that type of approach to the oil and gas business, fair?
I believe so, yes.
And you'd agree that there are also some business risks that are unique to only having smaller non-operated interests in oil and gas wells, fair?
Say that again?
Yeah, there's some risks that are absolutely tied to that business strategy, right? That, like, a large operated working interest owner has different risks than Vitesse's risks as a small, non-operated working interest owner over many, many wells, right?
I mean, I think the risks, the risks are the same on an individual well, across a variety of wells. The risks are the same. Obviously, if you have a smaller working interest, your overall risk is less than if you have a 50% working interest. And that's one of the reasons that Vitesse doesn't, typically take a large working interest. It's to avoid the risk of one specific well having a material impact.
Okay, and the way that I'm understanding what you're saying is you're referring more to like drilling risk. Is that the type of thing that you're talking about?
Drilling and
right now?
operating risk.
Okay, drilling and operating risk?
Yeah.
In terms of the ability to take in kind, for instance, it's easier, I'll concede that, for a operator or a large working interest owner to economically arrange take in kind, right, than a very small working interest owner. Is that fair?
Probably.
And you agree with me that that's just a business risk that's associated with the type of business that Vitesse has decided to run for itself.
I'm not sure I would consider it a business risk. I would say it's an operational reality.
Okay. On the take-in-kind issue, we'll get to it here in a second, what you said previously, but just to kind of circle back, another activity like the drilling, operating of wells that Vitesse is dependent on its operators for is Vitesse has chosen to rely wholly on its operators to market and sell its oil and natural gas extracted from its wells, correct?
Yes.
And, I mean, what we're saying there is Vitesse doesn't take in kind like you testified earlier, right?
That is correct.
And you mentioned that Vitesse explored taking in kind back in 2016 and 2017. Do you recall that?
I do.
How many wells did Vitesse own an interest in at that time?
Probably close to 4,000 or 5,000.
Okay, and how many Hess-operated wells were in that 4,000 to 5,000 in that time frame?
Probably less than 200 or 300.
Okay, but still, at that point, Vitesse was in several hundred Hess-operated wells. Is that fair?
Hard for me to know exactly, but it was, if we're in 900 now, the vast majority of those 900 came from the acquisition that we made in 2018.
Okay. But fair to say before that acquisition, that Vitesse was receiving revenues and revenue statements on a monthly basis from Hess, right?
Yes, we were.
So you were familiar with the prices that Hess was paying compared to other operators on oil, gas, and NGLs at that time, right?
We would have had the accounting information inside our company to know if we chose to analyze it. Again, as I mentioned, it was a relatively de minimis number of wells compared to all of the wells that we had. It was, a couple hundred wells on 4,000 or 5,000 wells.
Okay. But you had the information in hand to, at the very least, to know what the ultimate sales prices Hess was receiving for oil, gas, and NGLs.
It would have been part of our accounting records. It just didn't rise to a level that would have come to my attention.
Okay. And Vitesse, as an entity, I'm not just you, but also would have known what types of deductions Hess was taking out of those in the net proceeds payments to Vitesse at that time, right?
Sure.
And with that information in hand, Vitesse in 2018 made the decision nonetheless to purchase roughly 700 or 800 additional wells where Vitesse was operator, right?
Yes.
Okay. Now, Vitesse, since it doesn't take in kind, I assume it doesn't have any of its own midstream contracts.
We do not have any midstream contracts.
And I assume Vitesse doesn't have its own arrangements to transport production out of the basin, right?
We do not.
Vitesse owns no midstream infrastructure, is that fair?
We do not own any midstream.
And it doesn't operate any midstream infrastructure, right?
That's correct.
Okay, so you would agree with me that if Vitesse doesn't handle any of these activities for itself, its operators are in a position, practically speaking, where they have to sell Vitesse's share of oil and gas in order to keep producing their wells, right?
They have to sell oil and gas. That's part of what they're required to do.
Okay, and required by what?
I think that's just part of, if you look at 3808, I think it talks about, in section 1, I think it talks about the fact that they'll drill and complete wells and then pay people accordingly to
Okay.
their interests.
And the point I'm trying to make here is if Vitesse doesn't handle the production by taking in kind or making other arrangements, and in a Hess-operated well, if Hess doesn't handle that production, who's going to do it? No one, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, they are the operator.
Okay, on the take-in-kind front now, has Vitesse explored any other options since 2016 to 2017 about the ability to take its oil and gas in kind?
I mean, we constantly kick it around and talk about it, but it was really back at that point in time that we spent most of a few months analyzing whether or not it would make sense, and talking to other non-operated working interest owners and other companies that said to us that they could, potentially help us with taking it in kind. But again, we concluded it just wasn't economically feasible.
Okay, so it wasn't economically feasible. That's what you just said, right?
That's correct.
It's not that it's impossible from some sort of operational or legal standpoint. That's not Vitesse's contention, is it?
It's not my understanding is that it would be possible.
Okay, Mr. Cree, let's change gears a bit and talk about some of Vitesse's statements in this lawsuit, okay?
Okay.
And by lawsuit, I'm specifically referring back to the lawsuit that was filed before the district court, okay?
Okay.
You've read Vitesse's complaint that was filed in the district court back in November of 2020, right?
Yes,
And you referred to that complaint actually in your testimony just a few minutes ago, didn't you?
I did.
When was the last time that you reviewed that complaint?
At some point in time during the last few months.
Okay, and was that in preparation of your testimony today, just to jog your memory of what that complaint said?
No.
Did you review that complaint before it was filed?
Yes.
And did you personally approve the filing of that complaint?
I did.
Okay, and who else at Vitesse would have been able to weigh in on that decision?
Other members of our executive team?
Okay, so the highest of the highest at Vitesse had to say on whether or not to sue Hess, right?
Yes.
And all of them would have had to look at that complaint, decide that that's what they wanted to say as Vitesse, and approve its filing before the court, right?
I'm not sure that they would all have to look at what was said, but they would have understood the process of going through. But not everyone is required to do everything associated with filing a lawsuit.
Got it, but you did though, right?
I did review it, yes.
I'm going to ask you some questions about that complaint, and before we do that, I'm going to actually get you a copy. Mr. Hearing Examiner, may I pass a copy of Vitesse's complaint to the witness?
Yes. Any objection?
No objection.
Go ahead.
And in rebuttal to some of the things that we've heard in the opening statement and Mr. Cree's testimony just now, I would like to introduce a copy of the complaint as a rebuttal exhibit, Hess's 45.
I don't have any objection.
All right.
As long as you got a copy from me.
I have a lot.
The exhibit is admitted.
All of you wanted more.
Yeah, my only objection would be this is an incomplete copy. It doesn't show any of the really interesting exhibits that go along with this, so.
Well, note that it's lacking its exhibits.
Thank you. Okay, Mr. Cree, you'd agree with me that what's marked as Hess Exhibit 45 in front of you is a copy of Vitesse's complaint to the district court without exhibits, as Mr. Kevin Evans noted for us, right?
That's what it appears to be to me.
Okay, I'd like to start our talk about this complaint in paragraph 18, please. Can you flip there?
I'm there.
Okay, are you there, Sarah? Could you read the first sentence of that paragraph out loud for us, please?
Sure. One of the administrative services an operator provides on behalf of all non-operated interests is to market the non-operator's share of oil and gas production from the well.
Okay, and you'd agree with me that those are Vitesse's own words, right?
Yes.
Okay, and so, for instance, and I think consistent with what you said just a bit ago, you'd agree, following what's in this paragraph, that one of the administrative services that Hess Bakken provides as operator to Vitesse, as non-operator, is to market Vitesse's share of oil and gas production from the subject wells, right?
Yes.
And if you flip through Vitesse's complaint, you'll see that there are various headings and titles throughout it. Do you see that? They're in bold typically.
Yes.
Okay, could you flip back a page from paragraph 18 and tell us what the heading is for the section that paragraph 18 is in?
It says well operations, general background.
All right. And again, paragraph 18, in Vitesse's own words, is talking about operators marketing production for non-operators, like Hess Bakken does for Vitesse, right?
Yes.
Okay, now, if you could look at paragraph 19, please. And can you read the first sentence of that paragraph for us?
Yes. An integral step between obtaining oil and gas production from a well and marketing it for sale is the midstream process, which may include gathering, processing, treating, compression, and transportation of the produced hydrocarbons.
Okay, and again, these are Vitesse's own words, correct?
Yes.
That you reviewed and approved before the complaint was filed, right?
Yes.
Okay, I spent some time on Google last night to look up the definition of the word integral. And what Google tells me is that that word means necessary to make a whole complete, essential, or fundamental. Does that sound like a fair definition of that term for you?
I would say that it would, our reference here would be, it's an important step. It's a
just-
key step.
Okay, key or necessary?
Objection. Misstates the testimony.
Is the question what his definition of the word is, or?
Not Google. I don't care what Google says.
Yeah, I guess.
I think it's an important step.
Okay. If that step doesn't happen, can you produce the well?
You could produce the well. I don't think you could produce it under existing rules and regulations.
Fair enough. You could not produce the well legally, correct?
That's true.
Or prudently.
Prudently.
Okay, going back to paragraph 19 and what it says. Vitesse says specifically that there's a step between obtaining oil and gas production from a well and marketing it for sale, right? You with me so far?
I think so.
And that step is referred to as the midstream process, correct?
Yes.
And that midstream process, as described here, according to Vitesse, could include gathering, processing, treating, compression, and transportation of produced hydrocarbons. Am I right?
That's what it says.
All right, and as was the case with paragraph 18, this paragraph that Vitesse wrote here in paragraph 19 is in the section of Vitesse's complaint that's styled well operations, right?
Yes.
All right. Let's move to paragraph 20, please. Can you read that paragraph for us?
Yes. The operator enters into agreements with midstream companies or other third parties to obtain these services on behalf of all interest owners in the well.
And these services that Vitesse references in that paragraph, you'd agree with me that that's referring to the various midstream services that we were talking about back in paragraph 19. Is that fair?
I would think so, yes.
All right, so tracking what's said here in paragraph 20, you'd agree that Vitesse alleges that operators like Hess-Bakken enter into agreements with midstream companies for midstream services on behalf of all interest owners in the well, right?
Yes.
And again, this paragraph 20 is also found in the section of Vitesse's complaint that's titled well operations, right?
Yes.
Okay, let's go to paragraph 21, please.
Okay.
And I'm going to read the first couple of sentences for us. It says, proceeds from the sale of oil, gas, and NGLs typically are settled on a monthly basis, and payment is remitted by the purchaser to the well operator. The operator then remits payment on a proportional basis, pairing the revenue distribution to non-operated interests. Did I read that correctly?
Yes.
And those are Vitesse's words again, right?
Yes.
And as with paragraphs 18, 19, and 20, paragraph 21 is also in the section of Vitesse's complaint that's titled well operations, right?
That is correct.
And in this paragraph, Vitesse is talking about the operator selling oil and gas, getting a price, and then making revenue distributions on a net basis to its non-operated working interest owners, correct?
Generally, yes.
Okay, now, could we flip to page, paragraph 52, please?
52. Okay.
Could you read the first couple of sentences there for us, Mr. Cree?
Vitesse has authorized HBI-2 to act as its agent in drilling and operation of the oil and gas wells and to act on its behalf. This authorization includes incurring reasonable fees for midstream services required to produce and prepare the oil, gas, and NGLs for sale. Vitesse has trusted HBI-2 to fulfill its fiduciary duties.
Okay, and again, these are Vitesse's own words, right?
Yes.
And words that you reviewed and approved before the complaint was filed.
Yes.
All right, and the HBI-2 that's mentioned here, you'd agree that that's Hess-Bakken, as Vitesse styled it in the complaint, right?
Hess-Bakken Investments 2, yes.
All right, so in the sentences that we have in front of us in paragraph 52, you'd agree with me that Vitesse is alleging that it has authorized Hess-Bakken to incur reasonable fees for midstream services required to produce and prepare the oil and gas and NGLs for sale, right?
Yes.
And you'd agree with me that in these statements that Vitesse is alleging that Vitesse authorized Hess-Bakken to incur those fees for midstream services as part of its authorization concerning the drilling and operation of the oil and gas wells, right?
That's what it says.
Okay, Mr. Cree, you can set that exhibit aside.
Okay.
And if you could, sir, flip back to the 10K, which is Hess Exhibit 35. And that's the 10K that you were discussing with Mr. Evans just a little earlier.
That's gonna be in the black books, right?
Yeah, it'll be one of the black binders. And it should be in volume 2, if that's any help.
It is, thank you. And it was
5?
35? Okay.
All right, Form 10K. Now that Vitesse is a publicly traded company, is something that you have the pleasure of filing on an annual basis from here on, right?
That is correct.
And I think you discussed what you understood a 10K report to be in your testimony with Mr. Evans, right?
I think, yeah, I guess, yeah. I don't know that I just described what a 10K was. I think he described what a 10K was, but
Okay, what is your understanding of a 10K?
it's a required disclosure to the Securities and Exchange Commission that needs to be filed annually that includes lots of information about a public company.
And that information includes overviews about the company's business and business strategies, right?
Yes.
And some of the risks that the company faces, just to make sure that the investing public knows what those risks are, right?
Does include risk factors.
And it also includes audited financial statements, right?
It does.
Okay. Before today, I think you said that you had reviewed this 10K. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Sitting here right now, is there anything that you recall from your time spent with this 10K that you would disagree with?
No.
Okay. So I think that in the securities world, it's materially misleading or something like that. No materially misleading statements are in this 10K. Is that fair?
That's what I believe.
Okay. If you could turn to page 33 of this 10K. Well, actually, I'm going to stop and ask you to turn to page 9.
9?
Yep.
Okay.
And let's see, at the very first sentence in the overview section, do you see where I'm referencing right now?
Where it starts out, we are.
Yes, sir. It says, "We are an independent energy company focused on returning capital to stockholders through owning financial interest as a non-operator in oil and natural gas wells." Did I read that correctly?
You did.
Okay. Can you help us understand what is meant by owning financial interests as a non-operator?
Sure, that just refers to owning a working interest or overriding royalty interest, and mineral interest. It's owning any type of financial interest, so we have a financial stake in the outcome of those wells.
Okay. How about, now we go to page 33.
Okay. I'm assuming the page before 33,
Yeah, it's,
not much on 33.
go to 33 and turn back 1.
Okay.
How about that? And there is a section there entitled "Drilling for and Producing Oil and Natural Gas are high-risk activities with many uncertainties that could adversely affect our financial condition or results of operations," right?
That is correct.
Okay. Go to the sentence in the first paragraph that begins "in addition." Do you see that? It's the last one before the list.
Yes.
And Vitesse says in the 10K, "In addition, drilling and production operations on our acreage may be curtailed, delayed, or canceled by our operators as a result of other factors, including," and then there's a list. Did I read that correctly so far?
Well, you said, I don't think you said producing. I think you may have said production operations. But generally, yes, you said it correctly.
Okay, so Vitesse in the 10K says drilling and producing operations, right?
Yes.
They may be curtailed, delayed, or canceled by our operators as a result of some factors some of these items in the list cover, right?
Yes.
All right. The second bullet there. Can you read that bullet for us, please? It begins infrastructure.
Yes. infrastructure limitations such as the natural gas gathering and processing constraints experienced in the Williston Basin in 2019.
Okay, so you would agree with me that infrastructure limitations or infrastructure constraints at the midstream level can impact drilling and producing operations on a well pad, correct?
Yes.
And what's happening at midstream can lead to wells being curtailed or shut in, fair?
Yes.
All right, now let's go down to the second to last bullet there. It says pipeline capacity curtailments. Do you see that?
I do.
And I was curious, does that refer to transportation or what pipeline capacity are you referring to there? Or is Vitesse referring to, if you know?
I would imagine that that is transportation.
Yeah, that was my guess as well, and I assume your answers about what we talked about in bullet 2 would equally apply to the bullet there referring to pipeline capacity curtailments, right?
Yes.
Okay, if you could turn to page 36 now, please.
Okay.
And I'm looking at the section that has the title Seasonal Weather Conditions, which may be impacted by climate change, so on. Do you see that?
I do.
Okay, the first sentence in that section says, seasonal weather conditions can limit drilling and completion activities, selling oil and natural gas, and other operations in some of our operating areas. Did I read that correctly?
You did.
Okay, and you would agree that the word other and other operations is meaning that you're talking about different operations than drilling and completion activities and selling oil and natural gas. Is that fair?
Yes.
Okay, if we could turn to page 52, please.
Okay.
And do you see the section in the middle of the page that says regulatory requirements to reduce gas flaring and to further restrict emissions could have an adverse effect on our operations, correct?
I do.
Okay. All right, let's work through this a bit. First sentence there says, wells in the Williston Basin of North Dakota, where we own significant oil and natural gas properties, produce natural gas as well as oil. Did I read that correctly?
You did.
And you agree with that statement?
I do.
And next sentence, constraints in third-party natural gas gathering and processing systems in certain areas have resulted in some of that natural gas being flared instead of gathered, processed, and sold. Did I read that correctly?
Yes.
Okay, and you agree with that statement?
I do.
All right. Sentence 3. In 2014, the NDI Commission, North Dakota's chief energy regulator, adopted a policy to reduce the volume of natural gas flared from oil wells in the Williston Basin. Did I read that correctly?
Yes.
And by NDI Commission, I assume Vitesse is referring to the Industrial Commission that we're before today. Is that fair?
Yes.
Okay, next sentence, the fourth sentence. The NDI Commission requires operators to develop gas capture plans that describe how much natural gas is expected to be produced, how it will be delivered to a processor, and where it will be processed. Did I read that correctly?
Yes.
And you agree with that statement?
Yes.
Okay, fifth sentence. Production caps or penalties may be imposed on certain wells that cannot meet the capture goals. Did I read that sentence correctly?
Yes.
And you agree with that sentence, right?
I do.
All right, now let's skip down to the first sentence in the next paragraph. And could you read that sentence for us, please?
Sure. Gas capture requirements and other regulatory requirements in North Dakota or our other locations could increase our operators' operational costs and restrict production on our oil and natural gas properties, which could materially
and adversely affect our financial condition, results, and operations and cash flows.
All right, in this sentence, you would agree with me that the operators that Vitesse is referring to, those are the operators of Vitesse's wells, like Hess-Bakken, right?
Yes.
And the operational costs that are mentioned here, what kind of operational cost is it that Vitesse is referring to?
Well, it would appear to me that we're talking about, kind of all costs associated with gas capture. So it would include gathering and transportation costs. I'm assuming that would also include all of our lease operating expenses, just anything that could happen. These are risk factors that we're disclosing. And the heading is to reduce gas flaring. So it would be anything that, the commission might enact and put in place.
Got it. Okay, could you turn to page 60 in the 10K now, please?
Yes.
Okay, and beginning with the word fluctuations, do you see that? It's at the very, let's see, second line of the page, kind of towards the right-hand side.
Okay, yeah, at the very top.
Yes, sir, you with me?
Yes.
Okay, it says fluctuations in our price differentials and realizations are due to several factors, such as NGL value, net of processing costs, gathering and transportation fees, takeaway capacity relative to production levels, regional storage capacity, and seasonal refinery maintenance temporarily depressing demand. Did I read that correctly despite my stumble through the word temporarily?
Yes, you did.
All right, and you'd agree with me that this sentence refers to certain NGL-related processing costs and gathering and transportation fees, right?
That's what it says.
Okay, do you see any other types of costs explicitly addressed in that sentence by name?
No, storage capacity, refinery maintenance, those are types of costs, but I think
Yeah, those are activities or things that you're doing, right?
but they have costs associated with them.
They do.
Yeah.
But in terms of direct costs that are referenced in that sentence, the only ones are processing cost and gathering and transportation fees, right?
Those are the ones specifically spelled out.
Okay, and those are, we can agree that those are post-production costs, right?
I believe so, yes.
Okay. Let's go to the next sentence now. It says, the exact impact of each of these items is difficult to quantify as each of our operators pass through these costs in a different manner. Did I read that correctly?
Yes.
And these costs that are referred to in that sentence, you'd agree that that's referencing back to the previous sentence, talking about the processing cost and gathering and transportation fees, right?
Yeah, the post-production costs.
Okay, now, there's one more sentence in that paragraph, and I'll ask you to read that for us into the record.
Sure. The final sentence of that, starting out, some operators.
Yes, sir, that's the one.
Some operators may deduct these costs directly from our revenues, while other operators may invoice them directly to us as lease operating expenses.
Okay, and do you have any reason today to disagree with what Vitesse represented in its 10K in that sentence and the previous sentences that we just read?
No.
Okay. And what type of accounting record do operators typically use to bill Vitesse for lease operating expenses?
Joint interest billing.
Okay, we can set the 10K aside.
So I guess if we're done with the 10K, I don't know how much more you have left, but it might be a good chance to take a quick break here and give our transcription
Yeah,
a
that's
break.
great, that's great.
So the time is it's 10:44 a.m. Let's meet back here at 10:55 a.m. to continue cross.
Thank you, Mr. Area Examiner.
we are back on the record in case number 29227, consolidated with case number 29226. Mr. Beatty, I believe you are going to continue cross.
Thank you, Mr. Hearing Examiner. Mr. Curry, do you still have the Hess binder of exhibits in front of you by chance?
I do, sir.
Does that one have Hess Exhibit 31 in it, I hope? Volume
Looks like
2?
it.
Yes. Can you turn there, please?
Yes. I have in front of me.
Okay, and this is the February 13th, 2023 Vitesse press release that you discussed during your direct testimony with Mr. Evans, right?
Yes.
Okay, and if you could flip over to page 4 and the table found on that page, I'd appreciate it.
Okay.
And just to make sure that all of our boxes are checked on the front end, the production heading or line item there does contain gathering and transportation costs, right?
It does.
And those are gathering and transportation costs that are passed on to Vitesse by its operators and their cost for midstream services, right?
Yes, they have been included in that classification of production.
Okay, and that classification of production is, and I know what you explained earlier today, but that categorization of production expenses is a type of operating expenses on Vitesse's financial statements at this time, right?
Yeah, it is an expense to operate the company, just as general and administrative expenses are, and depreciation, depletion, all of those things. So it's an operating expense of the company.
Okay, and has Vitesse changed the way that it does the accounting that we see in Exhibit 31, to your knowledge?
In what way?
Does it still use that production heading and subcategory of expenses?
No, I think we actually changed that.
Okay. And you changed it to what?
I think we changed that starting with the year 2023. I think we've now changed that to where gathering and transportation costs are all being netted out of oil and gas revenue. Instead of part of it being an expense and part of it being netted out, we've decided to put it all as a net against oil and gas revenues.
Okay. So in 2022, well, we've got 2022 and 2021 on the table in front of us, right?
That is correct.
Did Vitesse account consistent with what we see in this table back in 2020, 2019, and so far back until when it was founded?
It did.
Okay. So from the time that Vitesse was founded until 2022, on its books, Vitesse booked gathering and transportation costs from its operators for midstream services as an operating expense, correct?
For those operators that did provide us gathering and transportation expense as a separate breakout from the revenue statement, yes, we took those expenses and we booked those as an expense as opposed to netting them out of revenue. But if the operator didn't show that to us and just netted it out of revenue, then they would be netted out of revenue. So it was kind of a hybrid.
Got it. So, but just to be clear, the operating expenses that we see on this table and that we would see on other tables going back to when Vitesse began as a company, there would be at least some midstream costs passed on by operators in those operating expenses, right?
That is correct.
Okay, and then in February of 2023, Vitesse issued this press release with that sort of accounting, correct?
For 2022 results.
Okay. And then yesterday, after market closed, Vitesse announced its first quarter earnings, correct?
That is correct.
And you issued a press release associated with that, right?
We did.
And where we see production now, under operating expenses, the line item now says lease operating expenses, right?
It does.
And you're telling us today that that lease operating expenses, it doesn't contain any type of midstream cost?
It does not.
Okay, so for at least 2 years of time when Vitesse's lawsuit was on file, it, on its books, characterized some gathering and transportation cost as operating expenses, right?
It did.
And then it issued this press release in February. And Hess then deposed Vitesse's expert, and you may or may not know about this, but if you do, you can answer the question, and showed this document to him. You can see there's a stamp that says Posner Exhibit 9 on the front.
Okay.
That happened in March. Does that sound right?
Sounds right.
And then in May 2023, Vitesse issues a press release that completely changed the way that it's been accounting for post-production costs since the time that it was founded as a company, right?
That is correct.
Okay, we'll pass the witness.
Are there any questions from commission staff?
I have a couple questions. I'm looking at Exhibit 00. This is the revenue statement that you talked about.
Yes, sir.
The first question I have is, when I look through these, the only revenue statements that you listed, it appears that it's where you only had a royalty interest. Is that right?
I think these are just pages from much larger overall statements. So I think it appears that these exhibits included in here are related only to royalty. But if you looked at all of the pages, I guess there's probably, many, many pages that go with an actual revenue statement, that they would include working interest owner wells also.
No, I understand that. But my question is, I'm curious why you only included the royalty interest. Why wouldn't you have also included one that showed your working interest so we could have seen the charges that were listed there on the revenue statement?
I think for purposes of the demonstrative that our legal counsel was trying to make, they decided just to show royalty interest, I guess.
And in looking at the first page there, you've got the gas and the royalty interest shown with the transportation, processing, and compression. You had indicated those are post-production costs, right?
That's my understanding, yes.
And are you aware of any North Dakota case law that addresses that? And not necessarily that they're post-production costs, but that they're allowed on gas?
And I think I not necessarily case law per se, that's not what I do, other than anything that's been associated with this case in front of us. But I do realize that costs associated with post-production costs oftentimes come up when you might have royalty situations, and I know that from various leases, sometimes royalty leases might say you can or cannot deduct certain types of costs.
Okay, well, I'm not intimate with it, but as far as Bice versus Petrohunt, that was a district court decision that did address costs like this on gas and if they could get passed back to the royalty owner or not. So I just think it's important to mention that, and it may be something that you want to review.
Okay.
So as far as the costs that you're listing here for the royalty interest, would these also be very similar for your working interest that you have on wells?
I believe so, yes.
And as far as the plant products that you've got on the bottom here, what do those include?
I would assuming that those mean all NGLs that fall out of the gas stream. Hess calls that plant products, others will call it natural gas liquids. Some others will just include it in the gas stream, depending on if they're reporting on a 2-stream or a 3-stream basis.
Okay. In this revenue statement that you're showing, is this information that Vitesse has taken from Hess and inputted into this statement? Or is this actually a copy of the revenue statement that you get from Hess?
So it's not what we get from Hess, but it goes through EnergyLink, which is one of the third-party services that most of the operators use to report this information to non-operated working interest owners. It allows for the manipulation of that data in terms of the ability to upload it into your accounting system. So EnergyLink is just that third-party provider that Hess would work with and provide this information to EnergyLink is the way I understand how it works.
Okay, so do you actually get a physical copy of the revenue statement from Hess, or is this suffice for it?
I believe
Is
we
there-
get both. I believe we actually get something directly from Hess, which is identical to what we upload from EnergyLink.
Okay, thank you.
Are there any further questions from commission staff? Seeing none, redirect Mr. Evans.
Thank you, Mr. Henry. Just a few. Mr. Cree, you recall Mr. Beatty asked you questions generally about the oil and gas industry in North Dakota.
Yes.
Are you aware of whether there's anything unique about how oil and gas is drilled in North Dakota versus the other basins in the U.S.?
Not that I've seen.
How about transport, how oil and gas is transported? Anything unique about that in North Dakota?
No,
How about how it's processed? Anything unique about that in North Dakota?
not that I've seen.
How about how it's gathered? Anything unique about that in North Dakota?
No.
Mr. Beatty also asked you some questions about whether Vitesse had access to Hess accounting information before it filed this lawsuit, or actually before it made its acquisition. What was that acquisition that occurred that resulted in the increase in the number of wells? I'm sorry, thank you.
April 2018.
Okay. And prior to April of 2018, do you recall how Hess reported its deductions to Vitesse?
I believe it's in a similar fashion, but I don't remember specifically prior to 2018.
Do you recall any specific breakout or specific information provided, for example, under what was under processing, how they calculated the processing deductions?
Again, I don't remember specifically, but what I recall is that there was less detail provided, earlier on, and that the detail ended up getting a little bit better as time moved forward.
Because the NDIC forced operators to provide more information, right?
Yes.
Okay, and something happened in 2018 that resulted in Vitesse determining that there had been some significant differences between how Hess was charging and how other operators were charging, right?
That is absolutely correct. And again, prior to 2018, the interests that we owned in Hess Wells were such a small magnitude of our overall revenue that, from my standpoint, it didn't rise to my level. The higher costs were not of a magnitude that said, oh my goodness, we need to look into this, more completely and understand it. So it just was de minimis, and until we made that acquisition and had a lot more wells, we didn't realize just how much was being charged by Hess.
And is it fair to say that Vitesse tried to get an explanation from Hess about the difference between what Hess was charging versus what other operators were charging?
We did.
What was the reaction of Hess?
Again, from the accounting group that asked a lot of those questions was basically, it's really not any of your information, or any, it's not information that you are, that we need to provide you.
And thus the lawsuit was filed.
Yes.
Mr. Beatty also asked you a number of questions about the complaint that was filed in the district court case, which has now been marked as Hess Exhibit 45. Do you remember those questions?
I do.
Are you aware of any statement in the complaint where where Vitesse admitted that the commission has jurisdiction over midstream or post-production costs?
No.
Mr. Beatty also pointed out to you a comment about contracts between operators and midstream companies. Now that Hess-Bakken has produced the agreements in this proceeding, its agreement with Hess Trading Company, for example, are you aware of any agreement that Hess-Bakken itself entered into with any midstream company?
I'm not.
You remember, and if you don't, we can pull it back up, but Hess Exhibit 31, the press release, where Mr. Beatty asked you a number of questions about operating expense, do you remember that?
I do remember that.
When it said operating expense, was that an operating expense of Vitesse, or is that an operating expense of operators that Vitesse does business with?
It's an operating expense of Vitesse. I mean, it includes all of the costs that the company incurs to run the company, not just operating expenses or well-related expenses. It includes everything.
Are you aware of whether there's any statement in either that press release or Hess's 10K where where Vitesse says that operating expense means cost to operate a well on a spacing unit?
No.
And Mr. Hicks asked you some questions just a moment ago. I just want to clarify, see if I can clarify Vitesse's position in this. Is it fair to say that Vitesse isn't saying that post-production costs cannot be passed on, reasonable post-production costs cannot be passed on to royalty owners? Is that fair?
That is fair.
Okay. But if these post-production costs that we're talking about in this case are deemed to be cost to operate a well on a spacing unit, would you expect those costs to be deducted from Vitesse's royalty revenue?
I think that there would be a strong argument that, if I was a royalty owner, I might question that and say, these maybe shouldn't be deducted if they're truly operating costs.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Mr. Beatty's last question, I think he was trying to, or at least there was a suggestion that there was something nefarious about what Vitesse did in changing how it's reported expenses.
Yes.
Now, can you explain the reason for the change?
Sure, absolutely. So, again, historically, we were a private company. Our investor wanted to see lease operating expenses and gathering and transportation expenses separated out, but, from a financial perspective, for the purposes of our 10K and reporting, we went ahead and combined those into one category. Again, we had always kind of respected what operators sent to us. If they netted it out of revenue, we would net those out of revenue. If they sent those to us as an expense on a deduction from a revenue statement, we would include those as an expense. That's how we handled it as a private company. Once we became public in 2023, which occurred in January, we wanted to be more comparable to how most other non-operated working interest owners handle it. Primarily the one competitor or the one company that we're most correlated with, which is Northern Oil and Gas. And Northern Oil and Gas shows all of those gathering and transportation fees as a reduction of revenue. And so to be comparable, the analysts were asking us, why do you have some of your costs down here, some of them netted out of revenue? That's inconsistent. It doesn't seem to correlate with how some of the other operators do it. And it all manifested itself in, why is your production expense, $13 a BOE versus $8 or $9 a BOE? And it's because it included those gathering and transportation costs. So as a public company, again, we worked with our accountants, we looked at this, they said, it doesn't matter which way you put it, as long as it's in one or two categories. You can either net it out of revenue, or you can put it in expense. For us to be more comparable and to help analysts understand what our expenses were, we went ahead and said, okay, starting with as January 1 of 2023, we're going to go ahead and net those out of oil and gas revenue as opposed to showing them in a production expense line. It had nothing to do with this lawsuit or anything associated with what's going on here. Because again, it doesn't correlate to what the NDIC has, what their mandates are and are not. It's just a function of from an accounting perspective, how to make sure that we are properly disclosing things and helping analysts understand our business.
And fair to say Vitesse has SEC counsel,
Yes, they do.
and they assisted Vitesse in putting together the press releases and the 10K?
Yeah, Vincent and Elkins is our counsel, and they helped us, as did Baker Botts.
Yeah, not insignificant firms.
Not insignificant firms.
Yeah, and the filing that Mr. Beatty was alluding to in his last questions, you know, based upon your explanation, fair to say nothing nefarious about that in your mind?
Not even remotely.
Okay, and that's the first public filing that's occurred since Vitesse became a publicly traded company, correct?
Well, we filed our 10K in February that we related
enough.
to us, it related to a time period prior to us being a public company.
For
So we-
current period?
For current period. So we took the opportunity, once we became a public company, to make that change.
Okay, nothing further.
Any
Just a
requests?
couple of quick questions, Mr. Creed, to step in on the suggestion that nothing in North Dakota is different, okay? I'm looking at paragraph 17 of the complaint, which is Hess Exhibit 45.
First of all, I object to the question. That wasn't my question, that nothing was different.
It's, I guess.
But let me ask this question, I'll object again.
Sure, sure.
But I don't appreciate having my questions being mischaracterized.
Mr. Creed, I'm going to ask you a question
Noted and
about
overruled.
paragraph 17.
Sorry, the objection is noted, but overruled. Allow the question.
Sorry, Mr. Alexander. Vitesse says, in North Dakota, however, it is common practice for working interest parties with concurrent ownership of mineral development rights to conduct oil and gas operations without entering a JOA. Did I read that correctly?
You did.
Okay, and you would agree with that statement, right?
I would.
And you would agree with me that that is different than probably every other oil and gas producing jurisdiction that you've ever worked in the domestic United States. Isn't that right?
That is correct, but I don't think that's what he asked me.
Pass the witness.
In light of his statement, I don't need to clarify the mischaracterization of my question.
Any further questions from staff? Anything further for this witness?
No.
All right, we can move on to your next witness, Mr. Evans.
Can we take a second to switch positions? And
Give us 5 minutes. Mr.
Sure,
Remington,
let's take
maybe?
I guess, a quick 5-minute break here.
Thank you.
Oh, yeah. And we are back on the record in case number 29227, consolidated with case number 29226. Before we move on to your next witness, I believe we're going to have another appearance from one of Hess's attorneys here.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Hearing Examiner. My name is Jeff Keenly, Kuehnle. Don't ask how you get Keenly from that. And I'm with Haynes and Boone, also for Hess.
Thank you. I guess with that, Mr. Evans, we can move on to your, oh, sorry. You can move on to your next witness.
Thank you, Mr. Hearing Examiner. David, could you introduce yourself, please?
Yes, good morning. My name is David Posner.
All right, Mr. Posner, I'm going to swear you in. Please raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm under the penalties of perjury that the testimony you're about to give in this matter will be true and correct to the best of your knowledge and belief?
I do.
David, what do you do for a living?
I have a consulting business in the oil and gas industry.
And you're here to testify as an expert witness today.
I am.
David, could you give us an overview of your education, please?
So I have an undergraduate degree from Brown University and a master's in mineral economics from the Colorado School of Mines.
And do you recall when those degrees were obtained?
Yeah, I graduated undergrad in 1976 and I got my master's in 1981.
Please describe your work experience in the oil and gas industry.
So I've been involved in the oil and gas industry for over 40 years, and the focus of my business has been the above-ground marketing and midstream and transportation aspects of the business.
Could you give us a summary of the companies that you worked for?
Yes, I was an employee of 3 different companies, all of them independent oil and gas production companies that also were active participants in the midstream activity as well.
Do you recall the first oil and gas company you worked for?
The first company I went to work for was Ladd Petroleum Corporation out of Denver. I started at Ladd in 1980, and I was there about 10 years.
What did Ladd Petroleum Corporation do?
So in that era, Ladd was a substantial independent oil and gas producer with oil and gas production operations across various basins in the United States, and also owned and operated midstream facilities.
So what were your responsibilities with Ladd Petroleum?
So my ultimate responsibilities, I was the lead marketing executive for Ladd, so I was in charge of all the arrangements to market production, and I was also the executive in charge of the midstream operations for oil and gas.
What came after Ladd?
So in 1990, I went to work for Snyder Oil Corporation. I was also based in Denver, and my responsibilities for Snyder were very comparable. I was the lead executive for marketing and also in charge of the commercial aspects and the operations of midstream operations for Snyder Oil Corporation.
What came after Snyder Oil Corp?
So Snyder merged with a Houston-based company, Santa Fe, and became Santa Fe Snyder, and I was asked to take on the lead marketing role for Santa Fe Snyder and continued there for a little over a year, I believe.
So, forgive me if you already gave this information. You worked for Ladd Petroleum for approximately how many years?
About 10 years.
And then on to Snyder Oil?
Yeah, Snyder and Santa Fe Snyder together, I'd say was about another 10 years.
Okay. And then what came after Santa Fe Snyder?
So when I worked for Santa Fe Snyder, my position was Houston-based, but I didn't move to Houston, and I commuted from Denver. And ultimately, I made the decision that I was not going to relocate to Houston, and so I decided to leave the company. And in 2000, I started my own consulting business.
And what is that consulting business?
The company is named Envent Energy Limited Liability Company.
So what does Envent Energy do?
So the core of my consulting business is I work with primarily, I would say, mid-size and smaller producers who are very skilled in all of the geotechnical and engineering aspects of drilling and developing oil and gas projects, but they generally don't have significant expertise as to what happens with the production once it's actually, they're successful. And so, in essence, I became an outsourced executive for marketing and commercial midstream arrangements for my clients. And, you know, I had clients, I did have a major company at one point, but mostly smaller, mid-size companies.
And you continue to do that work today?
I do. I've had my business for, this is my 23rd year.
Could you give us a sense of the geographic scope of your oil and gas experience?
So I would say that I've been involved in almost every producing basin throughout the United States. Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, New Mexico, Texas, Oklahoma, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and I've also been involved in North Dakota projects.
Have you served on any corporate boards?
I have. I served a 3-year term with a large independent producing company, Matador Resources Company.
And where are they out of?
Matador is a Dallas-based company.
And you were there. You were with them for 3 years, you say?
Yes, I served a 3-year term.
So you were not an employee, but you were a board member?
I was a director.
Director. Have you been involved in any industry association?
Let me also mention that as a board member of Matador, I was asked to chair the marketing and midstream committee for Matador.
Have you been involved in any industry associations or groups?
I have. I served on the board of the Colorado Oil and Gas Association for more than 20 years, and I was served a term as the president or chairman of the Colorado Oil and Gas Association. I also spent a couple years on the board of the Independent Petroleum Association of the Mountain States, which today is referred to as the Western Energy Alliance.
Give us a sense, if you can, of what the function is of these groups.
So the Colorado Oil and Gas Association has members that are producing companies, midstream companies, interstate transportation companies, service providers, and the objective of the association is to advocate for the oil and gas industry in the state of Colorado.
Do you also provide expert witness testimony as a part of your work with Invent?
I have. I've done, I'd say, a relatively limited amount of that. It's been a small portion of my activities compared to my commercial work, but I have been involved in a number of legal disputes as well as some regulatory activity.
Could you give us an idea of what kind of settings that you've testified in?
So as far as legal situations, I've been in federal court in Colorado, in New Mexico, in Oklahoma, in Louisiana. I've been in Colorado State Court. I've been before the Wyoming Oil and Gas Commission.
And your testimony was accepted in those settings as an oil and gas expert?
It was.
Could you summarize the topics on which you testified?
So I'd say the majority of my expert work has been royalty situations where royalty owners have contested the value of production that they received as a royalty owner, the marketing arrangements that were in place for the operator.
How about disputes between midstream companies?
I've also been involved in disputes between producing companies and midstream service providers.
And when you've given this expert testimony, has it been on behalf of the royalty owners?
No, all my work has been representing producer clients.
Mr. Hearing Examiner, at this time I offer Mr. Posner as an expert to testify here in this matter today.
Any objection?
My only comment is, are we clarifying what he's an expert on?
Or I guess,
I don't believe I have to clarify what he's an expert on.
I guess as far as I'm midstream and everything, but yeah, I
Okay.
guess.
But that's fine.
Then the testimony will be received as that of an expert.
Mr. Posner, in the case we're talking about today, you were hired by Vitesse, correct?
Yes.
What were you asked to do?
I was asked to evaluate to the extent that certain charges that Hess is, or deductions from revenue that are made by Hess to Vitesse, are they part of a cost to operate a well on a spacing unit?
And how did you go about completing that task?
So I reviewed a number of documents which are listed in my expert report. I did meet with some Vitesse employees, and I relied on my industry experience.
Did you prepare a written report for this case?
I did.
Let's take a look at the binder in front of you. You could find
This
that-
binder?
It is that one. Yep. It's the white binder. If you could turn to tab UU.
Okay, I'm there.
What is tab UU?
This is a copy of the expert report that I prepared for this situation.
And that is a true and accurate copy of your report?
It is.
Mr. Hearing Examiner, I offer tab UU, the exhibit UU, into evidence.
Yes, it was stipulated yesterday, I think, right?
Consistent with Ms. Adair's report going in, that's fine.
Then exhibit UU is admitted into the record.
Mr. Posner, based on your experience in the oil and gas industry, have you formed an opinion in this case?
I have.
What is it?
It's my opinion that the various deductions, value adjustments in the revenue that Hess pays to Vitesse and are itemized are not costs to operate a well on a spacing unit.
And why do you believe that?
Well, I think a good way to get an overview of this is to look at a couple of these demonstratives behind me.
If you can reach it with your pointer.
I can. I got to keep the microphone handy.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
the kick, right?
Yep.
Okay, I got a little room here. So the two exhibits that I want to use as a good illustration and overview of why I believe that these are not cost to operate a well are two exhibits that actually were in Ms. Adair's report. And I believe that they both show nicely how the industry is structured and what constitutes and is well understood in the industry to be the cost to operate a well as compared to various downstream costs or value adjustments that occur in the normal value chain and distribution of oil and gas production. So if we look at this exhibit here.
You're pointing to figure 2,
Yeah.
which is figure 2 entitled The Oil and Gas Value Chain from Ms. Adair's report, correct?
And she's done, I think, a very nice job of showing schematically how the oil and gas industry is structured. And we have upstream in blue, midstream and dark green, downstream, which is actually users, and kind of in between here is the whole transportation network. And really, the activity in blue is the activity of the oil and gas producer. This is where wells are drilled, developed, operated, and production is brought to the surface. And this clearly, any costs that are experienced here are costs to operate a well. And so these costs would be well understood in the industry as operating costs for a well by an operator. Once the production leaves the production area, it's distributed and delivered into pipelines, and the custody is transferred at that point. And then everything that happens here is in essence a value adjustment. And all of the various values and fees at every point in this chain are different. And each value upstream of the previous value, or each transfer point, is connected to the transfer point by the fee structure that exists. So when production is sold here, there's a value here. And then that value is based on ultimately value here, less the fees and costs to deliver it at each point along the way. But these costs are not cost of operating. These are market-related value adjustments that don't relate to the operation of the well. And if we look at the photograph, and the drone that Ms. Adair used created beautiful photographs. I mean, really, those are lovely. Let's see if I can turn this way. That'll be a little better. Okay. It's okay? Yeah, okay, thank you. If you could just lay it over that one, can't you? So this photograph, which I think there was quite a bit of time spent yesterday on the Huron well pad and all of the equipment in and around it. And this really just beautifully shows this is what is part of a producer's operation. And there's extensive equipment here. There's pumps, there's storage tanks, there's, as I think Ms. Adair nicely described, there's separation. The product that comes to the surface is separated into oil, gas, water, and then and there's vapor recovery. So there's a ton of activity happening here. And all of this activity is within the scope of the cost to operate a well. And when the product is separated, the oil is delivered into this, what's called the lease automated custody transfer unit. This is really the measurement facility for the delivery of the oil production. It measures the volume, the quality. These are very sophisticated pieces of equipment. So once the oil enters the LAC, it then leaves into a downstream pipeline or into a truck or wherever the oil is to be disposed of. On the gas side, we have a gathering system tie-in here, and there's a meter here. And once that product leaves the drilling unit, leaves the well pad, it's now into what we looked at here. It's into the whole distribution chain. And from that point forward, sure, there are all sorts of costs, but those are not costs to operate a well.
David, is there anything in your report that would also help explain your opinion?
Yeah, I'd like to just quickly page through a few of the highlights or at least the significant items of my report.
Okay, so let's take a look at page 3 of your report.
Yeah, so I'd start my first conclusion. It's very simple here. Hess Bakken transfers title of the production at these LACT units and the gas meter. From that point on, it no longer has custody. It's not involved in any operations related to that production.
Any other points in your report?
Yeah, so I'd like to even point out in number 2, I think we talked about all of the things that happen here. The things that happen here by the producer, those are invoiced to co-interest owners through lease operating statements, joint interest billing. They've been, if they're capital, they were approved on an AFE. And that's how producers' costs are accounted for and charged back to co-interest owners. So anything that's there is relevant to the cost to operate a well. I think saltwater water disposal is charged back to a joint interest billing. So even though sometimes people characterize that as perhaps a midstream cost, that cost comes back here through a JIB. Deductions and value adjustments that are at issue in this case are billed through that mechanism.
How are they billed?
Well, they're shown, they're really reductions in revenue, and because of the regulatory actions of the commission, it's my understanding that while they're reductions in revenue for transparency purposes, they're to be itemized into the categories that I think have been covered here, be it gathering, compression. I think those were the main categories. So yes, those are shown on a revenue statement as costs, but they're really just sort of capturing what were the value adjustments that determine that price. When Hess Bakken transfers title at the well pad to Hess Trading, they do it under a sales contract. And that sales contract has a formula in it. And the formula says the price we're going to pay you at that point is based on wherever that product was sold, ultimately by Hess Trading, less any fees that Hess Trading incurred to get it to that next point. So it's a formula price, and yes, the revenue statements disclose the components of deductions that may have gone into that formula price, but those aren't operating costs. Those are, and they're not operating costs to operate, the cost to operate a well by Hess. Those are fees that were incurred along the distribution chain.
Let's take a look at perhaps page 4 of your report. I don't want to skip ahead, but I
Yeah, let me just make sure I didn't miss anything here that I wanted to highlight. So looking at my conclusion 5, Hess Trading has a number of agreements with midstream companies, including the Hess Midstream affiliated entity. And these are pretty intense agreements. I mean, they have very complex tariff provisions in them. But the equipment that's owned there is not owned or operated by Hess Bakken, the operator. It's owned by Hess and by Hess Midstream.
So, David, let me interrupt you for a minute there. Are you saying that there's no equipment on a well pad or a DSU? There's no equipment that belongs to a midstream company or could belong to a midstream company?
No. In fact, in most cases, the LAC unit is probably owned by the midstream company. It's basically a custody transfer piece of equipment. There'll be metering equipment for the gas stream, and so those are midstream facilities on a unit that are owned by the midstream company.
And generally not owned by the operator.
Generally not owned by the operator.
Sorry I interrupted you.
Well, I think that another point I want to make is that North Dakota's been an incredible producing area. And the growth in production out of the Bakken, has been phenomenal. But there have been other amazing producing activities throughout the United States. And there's really what happens here in North Dakota in terms of the process, the need for midstream facilities. And I think Mr. Gatling did a good job of explaining, midstream facilities are essential. Ms. Adair has talked about, yes, without midstream facilities, you can't produce oil and gas. The more a producer coordinates with a midstream company, the better, whether it's an affiliated company or an unaffiliated company. So this happens in the Permian, it's happened in the Marcellus and the Utica. These facilities need to be developed, but this is a different segment of the industry. It is not the operation of a well. Sure, they're connected. If we could go back to, I'd like to go back to the schematic here. There's been a lot said about, without these facilities, we couldn't produce. Well, every link in this supply distribution chain is essential. Without an active market, and we've had periods where there hasn't been an active market. Has that curtailed production in basins across the United States? Of course it has. Without interstate transportation, you can't produce. And as I think has been pointed out by the Hess case, without midstream, you can't produce. But the fact that you need these facilities doesn't mean that they're part of the operation of a well. Just like the operation of a well isn't a part of the operation of these facilities. So, I get that this is all essential, but it's not operating a well. It's a different segment, and she's done a nice job. She's outlined. This is a whole other part of the business. It's not operating a well.
David, I'm still on page 4.
Okay.
Should I move ahead?
Yeah, where can we talk about the scope of the facilities? Let's move to page 5, and I guess really it's my 8 and 9, and I think the map over here is helpful. We can leave it there. It's okay. I don't need to point to it. So this is a map, I believe, of the gas facilities, and in my report, there's also a map of oil facilities. And
For the, David, just for the record, let me identify it as, it is in the expert report of Lisa Adair. It is the gas reference map for Vitesse Matter, assets as of December 3rd, 2022.
Yeah,
So it's out of Adair's report.
and I think I have the same map in my report.
Okay.
But I could be wrong. So this shows the scope of the activity here. I mean, we're talking about a very large area, roughly 60 miles wide, 60 miles tall, 3,600 square miles. And I think in my report, I talk about, over 1,000 miles of gathering pipe for gas, and I think I can't remember the number for oil, it's maybe 500. So there's an extensive network of infrastructure here that goes well beyond the well pad, the drilling spacing unit. And, think back to the comment about there's a little bit of facilities that are midstream on the spacing unit. Yes, there is. Look at that in proportion to the scope of the facilities here that cover a huge area. It's minute in the context of what happens here. And all of the complex operations related to these facilities, and we covered them yesterday, the rail terminals, the processing plants, the compression, all of that is way beyond the scope of operation of a well.
David, what about the arm's length situation,
Yeah,
I'm
yes.
talking about the different parties and the relationship between the midstreams and Hess-Bakken.
So, you know, we've talked about Hess Trading. They take custody at the wellhead. Then Hess Trading has contracted with midstream service providers, including Hess Midstream. Well, Hess Midstream is a separate company. It's a company that's publicly traded. I mean, it's, you know, I think there was discussion of they share some expertise and some employees, but for all intents and purposes, it's like a third-party service provider. Highland Partners, One Oak Rockies Midstream. These are service providers that if you accepted Hess's theory here, somehow Hess-Bakken is involved in the operations of those facilities. And they don't own a piece of equipment. They don't touch any activities related to those companies. So I have a hard time fathoming how that could be within the scope of the Hess operations. Did those fees impact the revenue that was received by Hess-Bakken at the custody transfer? Of course they did. But those are value adjustments that are reflected in the price paid. They are not costs to operate that well by Hess-Bakken.
David, you've heard some testimony, or were you here yesterday?
I was.
And you heard the testimony?
I did.
You heard the testimony this morning?
I did.
Did you hear comments about payment in kind?
Yeah, I mean,
And
I think the issue
Just
of
real briefly, could you just summarize what that means
So, I
from a
mean,
practical standpoint?
the idea of a interest owner taking its share of production in kind is, you know, is an option often for a co-interest owner. I think it's been implied that somehow Vitesse should have, could have taken its interest in kind. I think the reality of a interest owner with a small percentage in a well to take it in kind, it's commercially, I believe it's commercially impossible to do that, and would be a major annoyance for all the parties involved in terms of administration. So I think that to somehow speculate that that was the right solution for Hess, I just don't think it's a feasible or practical alternative.
And David, what does that issue have to do with jurisdiction or cost to operate a well?
I don't think it's related to that. Should we turn to the rebuttal report?
Well, let
What
me
else
ask you.
do we have to cover here?
Let me ask you a few more questions before we get there.
Okay, ask me anything you like.
Okay. Well, okay. Did you hear Ms. Adair's testimony yesterday?
I did.
And have you read her expert report?
I have.
Are there aspects of Ms. Adair's opinion that you agree with?
Well, I mean, again, I think she's created much better demonstratives than I created, and her pictures are great. And she has a really clear understanding of how the industry works. I think that her interpretation is very creative, you know, to be able to speculate that somehow all of these things that are value adjustments that impact the price received by Hess, the producer at the custody transfer point, that those are, because their value adjustments are cost to operate a well, I just don't think that's plausible. And to say that midstream facilities are essential, they're necessary, that makes them part of the producer's operation, I don't agree with that. I think that as we've discussed, all sorts of things are necessary along the commodity value chain, supply distribution chain, and without any one of them, production stops or is curtailed. But those somehow fees are reflected in the revenue, then the value received at the custody transfer point does not, in my opinion, make them a cost to operate a well. I think the costs to operate a well are pretty well understood in the oil and gas business, and those costs are not within that scope.
David, did you prepare a rebuttal report to Ms. Adair's initial report?
I did.
And look in the binder in front of you and please turn to tab VV.
Okay. I'm there.
And what is that?
That is my rebuttal report.
Okay. And Mr. Hearing Examiner, it's my understanding I don't have to offer that at this time. It has been stipulated to, as I understand.
For
No objection.
Okay, Ed, I guess on mine, I don't have a VV in front of me here. I guess, was that passed out separately? So the exhibit is admitted, but, yeah, I
Okay,
guess. I
we'll
hope.
get you a copy of VV.
Yep, just a blank spot here. Oh, Share, we can maybe share here.
We'll share.
Uh,
I guess. Maybe some of them have it and some of them don't, looks like.
I'm not going to spend much time on it. So
Okay.
I don't plan to go through it point by point.
So, Mr. Hearing Examiner, we'll make sure that the staff's exhibit books during a break are complete.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. David, that's an accurate, true and accurate copy of your rebuttal report?
It is.
I earlier asked you what aspects of Ms. Adair's opinion you agreed with, and you indicated that, and you also went on, I believe, to talk about things you disagreed with. Are those also in that rebuttal report?
They are, and Rob, I kind of feel like I've sort of covered the highlights here. I would like to go back to one exhibit in my report, if I could.
Sure. Which one?
I'd like to look at
And your report is at UU, correct?
yes. The two schematics, which I believe are Exhibit 8 and 9, is that correct?
Yes, Exhibit 8 and Exhibit 9
Yeah, and if,
to UU are schematics.
yeah. So, I think this topic came up yesterday, and there are very extensive drawings by Hess Bakken of all of the equipment at each well pad and well site. And you can see it's extensive. There's a lot of detail here. And I have in my report one for oil and one for gas. And you can see these aren't easy to read, but basically on the Exhibit 8 at the top in the upper right, the gas basically is delivered off of the well pad into a service company midstream entity title passes. The same true on the oil. Everything shown on these charts was part of an AFE, was the cost to maintain, operate, run all that equipment by Hess Bakken, billed on a JIB through the lease operating statement procedure. And this, again, is a really good illustration of all the things that happen and all of the activities performed by an operator in the production and ongoing operation of a well. And the costs related to this are costs related to operating a well. I don't see any schematics by Hess. I didn't see any of any downstream facilities, any compression downstream, any plants. They don't put schematics together for that because it's not their equipment. It's owned by either the affiliate company or third parties. So again, this is just another illustration of a fairly clear and well understood definition of what constitutes the operation of a well on a spacing unit.
And so when you say you don't see those, do you mean you don't see those in AFEs?
Well, I don't, you wouldn't, I don't believe Hess-Bakken would go to the detail of providing schematics of equipment that they don't own and operate.
In an AFE? That's why I'm wondering.
Well,
where's-
this would be in an AFE.
Okay.
Anything related to this would be part of an AFE, but anything downstream would not be.
Okay. And you're referring to Exhibits 8 and
And 9.
9?
Yes.
Okay. David, did you hear Brian Cree testify earlier today?
I did.
And did you hear him answer questions about different filings, accounting terms, the Securities and Exchange Commission paperwork?
I did.
And you were deposed in this case, correct?
I was, by Mr. Beatty.
And he asked you similar questions about SEC filings regarding Matador, didn't he?
He did.
Remind us what Matador is and what your involvement was again?
Matador is a substantial oil and gas producing company.
And they're a public company
Correct.
required to file SEC documents with the Securities and Exchange Commission.
Correct.
Do you believe the terminology about operation costs used in Matador's SEC filings means the same thing as costs to operate a well?
I don't.
Why not?
Well, I think Mr. Cree did a good job of explaining that these are statements of financial performance of a company. They're, to the extent that various costs are shown there, they're the cost of operating that company. It's a macro view of a company. It's not in any way relevant or intended to relate to what is the cost to operate a well on a spacing unit.
David, could you give a summary of your opinion in this case? And why you believe it?
My opinion, and this might be a good illustration again, to just put that one back up if we could.
And so you're referring to figure,
You could put it in the middle, please.
you're referring to figure 7, which is
Yes.
entitled Figure 7 Hess. I'm going to pronounce this wrong. Uran well pad.
Yes. So all of the activity shown in this photo and all of the costs related to those activities, those are the costs to operate a well on a spacing unit.
So where do we draw the line, David?
Once the production enters the custody transfer sales meter, and at that point the product is sold. So for oil it's the LACT, for gas it's the gas meter. All the activities from that point forward are not cost to operate a well. They're adjustments to the value of that product at that point, and they can be itemized all sorts of ways. They can be shown on a revenue statement as, yes, these were the things that adjusted the value that Hess-Bakken received at that point and paid to Vitesse. That they're shown as adjustments to revenue, those are for disclosure and transparency purposes. Those do not somehow imply that those are costs to operate a well. Those are adjustments in value, and they occur because value is established all along the supply distribution chain, and at every point from a point forward or backward, the relationship of value between those points is generally determined by the fees that are required to get there. But those are not costs of operations.
Thank you, David. Pass the witness.
All right, well, it's just about 12:10 here. Would it be a good time for us to take a lunch break here?
I'll defer to the commission. I can push through. I don't think it's going to be a long cross, but it's up to, I'll defer to you guys.
I'm fine to continue if it's up to you.
All right, well, let's go ahead and try to push through then. Go ahead and New Cross.
was looking at the time before I said good morning, but it's good afternoon, Mr.
Yeah,
Pope.
yeah, we crossed the,
We crossed
we
the
crossed the
threshold.
noon barrier, so, good afternoon.
So we haven't met before, correct?
Okay, remind me your name?
My name is Jeff. Jeff, just call me Jeff, it's fine.
We have not met before, Jeff.
Okay, so it's my understanding that you're here today to testify about what the cost of the operation of a well on a spacing unit in North Dakota means. Is that correct?
Correct.
You're not from North Dakota, correct?
I am not.
Actually, the first time you ever set foot in North Dakota was a couple days ago, correct?
I had my first chance to deplane in North Dakota, yes.
Did you fly in from Brooklyn?
I came from Brooklyn, yes.
Okay. So I think it's fair to say then you've never been on site at any North Dakota facility.
I have not.
And in your employment context, you've never been in charge of any North Dakota operational assets.
Not any North Dakota. I'm not on the operating side, no.
And you've never dealt with the North Dakota, with the NDIC before, the commission?
I have not.
And I think you mentioned that one of your employers may have had North Dakota assets, but the only employer that even had a North Dakota asset, that was what, 40 years ago?
No, I've had consulting company
Consulting.
engagements with North Dakota activity in the Bakken era.
But you haven't revealed any details about any of those
I
consulting?
have not, but I've had several North Dakota clients.
Okay, but you won't share those details? with us.
I've not provided that.
And you're not an expert in North Dakota law,
I am not.
North Dakota regulations,
I am not.
or oil and gas regulations in general?
That is correct.
In fact, you were not even aware that the statute we've been talking about, 3808082, even existed before you were retained in this case.
That's correct.
You're not an engineer,
I am not.
not a geologist,
I'm not.
not a lawyer,
Thank God, no.
You're doing a pretty good job. Maybe you should consider it. Not a landman,
Not a landman.
not an accountant.
I have a financial background, but I'm not an accountant.
You're not an accountant, not a CPA.
Happily not to be an accountant as well.
Now, I know you briefly discussed your involvement with the Colorado Oil and Gas Association. That's essentially a PR group, right?
It's an industry advocacy group.
Okay, I mean, for instance, the president of the Colorado Oil and Gas Association is a journalist by trade, right?
No, it's an industry. The chair of the Oil and Gas Association, which I was, is always an industry leader, be it a producing company. I was the industry leader of Colorado Oil and Gas Association because of my involvement with Snyder Oil Corporation.
Okay, but you're aware there was an acting president for the Colorado Oil and
A
Gas
staff
Association?
person.
There's an acting president and chief executive officer, correct?
Correct.
A gentleman named Dan Haley, correct?
A great guy.
Never worked in the oil and gas industry before this.
That could very well be.
He was a writer for the Denver Post.
A good writer.
Okay, all right. So as far as your work, you've never been involved in drilling or production?
I've been involved in the sense that I've worked in companies where drilling and production was the core activity, but I never was responsible for drilling and production.
Okay. So you're definitely not an expert in North Dakota operations?
Or any drilling and production operations, other than I'm very knowledgeable and familiar about the interface between oil and gas production operations and all of the activities that happen after that.
Right, but you personally haven't been involved in operations?
That's correct. I've been involved in operations of midstream facilities.
But not the operation of a well?
That's correct.
Have you ever been involved in upstream operations?
No.
So you're here, even though you have no experience or limited experience in North Dakota, you're here to testify to us about operations of a well in North Dakota.
About the interface and what is the boundary of those activities, correct?
Now, you talk about the interface. You were here for Mr. Gatling's testimony, correct?
I was.
And you heard him testify as to the integration between and coordination between Hess Bakken and Hess Midstream, correct?
I did.
And you heard him describe how Hess Bakken uses a development plan to coordinate and drive the development of midstream.
Right. The same as every company I've
Right.
been involved in. Nothing unique there.
So you don't dispute that happens?
No, I think that's important and should happen.
Will you agree with me that operations can have different meanings depending on the context of the use of the word?
I think operations could mean like a surgery, it could mean anything. Depends on how it's used, yeah.
Well, even with oil and gas companies,
It can-
operations can have
It can
different
have
meanings.
different interpretations. The context is important, I agree.
Do you have a list of the costs that Vitesse is challenging in this matter?
Do I have a list of them?
Yes.
I've seen different statements with those. I've not dug into the merits aspects of this case.
Do you know if Vitesse is charges for interstate transportation?
I don't think I know at this point exactly what all is in the bucket of charges that are in dispute.
Okay, because I heard some discussion yesterday about the extent of charges being challenged, but you don't even know if interstate transportation is being challenged.
I don't know for sure, but I would suspect that's not part of the core issue here.
Right, because that's a standardized rate, correct?
Yeah, or may not even be reflected in those deductions. Depends on where the product was sold.
Okay. I mean, you can't think of a reason why someone would challenge the cost of interstate.
Generally, I would say
transportation.
not.
Now, we talked about gathering, and you agree that gathering lines connect onto the drilling spacing unit and traverse across multiple drilling spacing units.
I think that every spacing unit has a meter on it, and it's not impossible that gathering lines would cross a spacing unit. I think generally when gathering lines are put in, they're put in under separate land and surface agreements, so they may incidentally cross a spacing unit. They're not part of the spacing unit.
Well, they're on the spacing unit, though,
Or
correct?
under it,
Under it, on it, through it.
yeah. Crossing it, yes.
Well, I mean, a well's on a spacing unit, but it may be under it as well, too.
Right.
Right. So in the same way that a well would be on a spacing unit, a gathering line would be too.
Could be. It could be there under different land ownership. It just depends on the situation.
And I think you've agreed that without gathering lines, wells in North Dakota could not continue to produce.
They're essential.
And without processing, wells could not continue to produce.
Essential. Customers are essential. Interstate transport is essential. Lots of stuff is essential.
Have you reviewed the North Dakota flaring order?
I have not.
So you're not familiar with those terms at all?
I'm generally aware of it, but I've not spent any time looking at it.
Okay. So you have not taken into consideration the North Dakota flaring order in your work?
I don't think it's significant to my work, no.
Are you aware that there are not joint operating agreements for most, if not all, of the wells in dispute in this case?
I have heard that.
Okay. So if there's not a joint operating agreement, that would leave this commission and the units that are formed to provide the governance between the parties.
I'm not an expert on
Okay.
what provides the governance
Okay.
of this situation.
Now, I know you mentioned custody meters, and you talked somewhat about custody transfer. Did you personally, well, first of all, these schematics, you talked about the schematics, I think. Did you personally pull these schematics?
I did.
And you pulled them from a much larger
I
group?
just picked a couple samples.
And so these weren't, I know you kept saying these would be attached to an AFE. These didn't come off an AFE, did they?
It's possible that they were produced after, but the equipment that was on it, I would presume was AFE'd at one point or another.
Now, these schematics continue though, right?
Continue in what respect?
Well, there's another page of the schematic and another page of the schematic on top of that.
I mean, there's tons of detail about the equipment that Hess-Bakken has put in place, yeah.
Well, is what I'm saying, for instance, if you look at the first schematic you looked at the bottom, I think you referred to it as Exhibit 8, maybe is that what you said?
I think it was, is my understanding. I don't know why it's not labeled that way here, but
Okay, well, so on Exhibit 8, if you'll see to the right of that schematic, there's two kind of arrows. Do you see that?
yeah.
And there's a number inside those arrows. What are those?
Offhand, I'm not sure I can tell you.
Okay, but you reviewed these schematics as part of your expert work.
I looked at the schematics and was able to conclude that the schematics show equipment owned and operated by the producer around the well and where the product is then delivered for delivery into sales lines.
But in fact, isn't the number inside those arrows a control number for an additional schematic that attaches to the right of this?
Objection, he's already answered that he doesn't know what that number is for.
Okay, so you
I
don't,
don't think that any of this, I looked at a bunch of schematics. I don't think any schematic showed any midstream equipment.
okay, but you don't even know if this is the complete schematic.
Well, I think, as I said, there's extensive schematics, and I picked a sample.
Okay, but as what I'm saying, yeah, I understand there's extensive schematics, and you picked a sample, but you didn't even pick the complete sample of that operation. did you?
I picked the one that was relevant to the issue that I was looking at.
And how is it relevant?
It was relevant because it showed equipment on the site and a custody transfer point.
So it shows the sales meter on here?
I believe it does. I think it says gas to sales gas at the very top, sales gas manifold.
It says two sales gas
well-
manifold and gives you a control number for another schematic, doesn't it?
Right. And maybe there's a schematic of the sales gas manifold, but it's clearly showing that at that point, the product leaves the lease.
That's your interpretation, I guess.
That is.
Okay. Now, would you agree that two parties could, in their agreement, place the custody transfer point further downstream from the well pad?
I mean, it's not common, but it's possible.
I mean, you could definitely agree that the custody transfer point is, for instance, after the gathering system, correct?
Generally not.
You could not agree to that?
Well, I think it generally doesn't occur.
Okay, but I'm asking if you could agree to that.
To me, it doesn't make sense, so no, I can't agree to that.
Okay, you can't. Okay, I'm not asking if you agree to that. I'm asking, can two parties agree to do that?
I think a custody transfer meter is where parties transfer custody, so I'm not sure I understand
Right,
the
but
question.
two parties that are free to contract can determine where custody is transferred, correct?
Hypothetically, I guess that's true.
Right, and so the two parties could then agree to move the custody point further downstream, correct?
They could. I'm having trouble making any sense of that, but
Okay.
that's possible.
So you're saying there's never a sales contract that might be at the inlet of the processing plant?
Very uncommon.
Okay, but it happens, right?
I don't know that I've been involved in a situation where that happened.
Well, what I'm going to ask you is, under your theory that operating costs are defined by the place of custody transfer, if two parties moved that custody transfer point, would it change all those prior costs being operating costs?
So, I mean, I think you're misinterpreting. Custody transfer is an important part, but other important parts are how are the costs billed and who owns and operates the equipment. So I don't think it's a single, the combination of those factors, I think,
Okay.
clearly sort of defines what's within the scope of the operation.
So it's based upon ownership of the equipment, custody transfer point, and how it's billed.
Those to me would be primary factors.
But it's not based on the function of the services?
Well, I think that's probably another good
Okay.
add to that, yeah.
Function of the services obviously
Yeah.
have to be important, right? Would you agree that how a cost is billed does not change the function of the service?
I mean, without the specifics, I'm not sure I can comment.
Well, I'm saying if I put gathering on a jib versus gathering on a revenue statement, it's still gathering, correct?
I guess if that's what you called it, yes, it could be.
You have not reviewed any leases as part of your work in this case, have you?
I have not.
And you haven't given any opinions on royalties or leases in this case?
I have not.
And that's because this case is really about working interests and not royalties, right?
And I think at this point about jurisdiction, so didn't really address that.
Would you agree with this statement? Effective marketing by a producer requires planning and development of access to pipelines and markets with adequate capacity to make it possible to sell the growing gas production.
I not only agree with it, I wrote it.
We'll visit a few more of those then.
I'm going to object at this point. If we're going to cherry pick statements, I think it's appropriate to have the entire statement, the entire, whatever he's reading from, should be presented to the witness, or at least to me.
I'm not asking to admit this. I'm asking if he agrees with the statement.
And I think it does follow a similar line of questioning we had yesterday regarding the deposition, so I'm going to overrule the objection, but your objection is noted.
Would you agree that in the Bakken, over the time period described by Mr. Gatling, that the development and construction of gathering and processing capacity was essential to support growth of production and to deliver gas to downstream markets?
I would.
Would you agree that no reasonable exploration and production company would undertake a large-scale drilling and production program unless it had access to firm midstream capacity?
I generally would agree with that.
Pass the witness.
Are there any questions from commission staff? All right. We can go to redirect.
So David, why are you living in Brooklyn? And
So-
if you could just give us an idea of where you're at, where you've been physically.
Yes, I spent 40-plus years in Denver, where that's been the core of my activity and the bulk of my adult life. But I did move to Brooklyn about 3 years ago for family reasons. And so I've been based in Brooklyn. At one point, I thought I'd split my time between Denver and New York, and I pretty quickly realized that that was going to be practically very difficult. So
You're aware that Hess has its main headquarters not in North Dakota, correct?
are they Houston based?
Houston, perhaps even New York.
Oh, if they're in New York, we could get together.
So earlier, Mr. Keenly asked you some questions about, well, let's stick with the North Dakota issue. Is there anything unique about producing and developing and producing oil and gas in the Bakken? Anything unique about how the commodities are gathered as opposed to other basins?
I mean, I think as pointed out, I'm sure there's unique aspects to development, drilling, production of wells, and the geology, technology, but the connection of production, the need for various other segments of the business, midstream, downstream, processing plants, those are common features of pretty much every major development project that I've been involved in, and I've been involved in a number of them across basins in the U.S.
So, those of us, me included, that were born and raised in the state of North Dakota like to think that we're really special, right?
You are, Rob.
But can you tell me, is there anything so special about the way a well is operated, an oil and gas well is operated in the state of North Dakota?
Well, I can't speak, as I think it's been pointed out. I'm not sure I could speak to the details of that operation, but in terms of the interface between production activities and various downstream, midstream processing, I believe that generally follows the same pattern as other basins.
Are you familiar with the North Dakota Petroleum Association?
I've heard of it. I have never had any involvement with it.
Okay. Are you aware that their executive director is a man named Ron Ness?
I'm not.
So you wouldn't know that his prior job was as a lobbyist for a legislator,
Not a journalist?
not a journalist.
Okay, well,
Okay.
well skilled, I would assume.
Can you tell me about how does a flaring order, the flaring order that was referred to during your cross-examination, you indicated that it did not affect your opinion, correct?
Yes.
Why not?
Well, I mean, reduction in flaring, minimizing flaring is, there's no controversy. That's an important and essential part of a good oil and gas operation by the production company, the midstream company, all of the parties involved. And having adequate facilities to manage and distribute the product to market is fundamental. But, you know, unfortunately, there have been situations where flaring has to occur and it doesn't really change the configuration of how the various roles of different participants in the industry are structured.
I have no further questions.
Commissioner Cross?
I only have one housekeeping matter, is when we were putting in his exhibits, I don't think we ever admitted Ms. Adair's rebuttal exhibit. I can ask him about it to admit it, but if there's no objection, I just want to make sure it has Exhibit 7.
Sure. I think it was probably part of the stipulation, but
Yeah, we'll stipulate to that.
Okay.
then we will admit Ms. Adair's exhibit. Do you have the exhibit number in front of you? Or?
I believe it's 7, Hess 7, I believe.
So, exhibit, so has 7, the
Seven.
Adair. 7.
7, yes.
7, yeah, okay. The exhibit is admitted. All right, I guess anything further for this witness?
No, Mr. Hearing Examiner. Thank you.
Okay, seeing that, it is 12:30 p.m. I guess perfect time to take that hour for lunch break here. And we'll meet back
We-
here at 1:30 p.m. I guess
Okay,
before.
yeah, Mr. Hearing Examiner, we
We're on the record in case number 29227 and case number 29226. Mr. Ford, you were telling me that that included Vitesse's case?
yes.
All right. Is there anything further in this matter that we need to address before we close the hearing?
Only one thing, Mr. Examiner, I think the parties stipulated in lieu of closing arguments that we would do post-hearing briefs, and we stipulated to the length of time, and I believe those dates, if I looked at it right, would come out to May 31st. Kevin, that correct? For simultaneous filing of the initial post-hearing briefs with simultaneous, filing of the responsive briefs being due June 12th.
Responsive briefs. All right, and that is my recollection as well. So the record will remain open for those supplemental briefs, May 31st and June 12th respectively. I guess.
Who's getting the transcript?
And we've talked earlier, Mr. Hearing Examiner, Mr. Mann, myself, and Bethany Cattermas, that Stephanie with Emineth and Associates will be delivering the final copy of the transcript of the proceedings to Bethany directly.
Yes, I think that should work. And is that going to be electronically? I think is preferable if that's possible. Right. Yeah. So that should work.
Bethany also said you'd be paying for it?
Oh, yeah. I haven't heard that.
Is there a time frame on when that's going to be delivered?
No.
Should there be one?
Are you paying for that? It'll be, I'm gonna try and get it to you sometime, the final, late next week or the week after. It just depends on my work schedule.
Okay, very good.
It'll be before May 31st.
Well, thank you. I guess anything further in this matter?
Not on behalf of Hess, Mr. Examiner.
Not on behalf of it.
Well, just one question. Do you want us to complete your hearing books for you, or what is your plan? I realize this is not typical, so I'm just wondering if you want us to take the hearing books back, or?
I guess it might be helpful for us to have hearing books, but it should all be electronic for cleaning up anything that we might be missing. So,
You want us to leave one set?
or for just the the completed set for,
Yes.
yes, yeah, that would be
Just one set.
preferable, yes.
We'll make sure they're accurate.
Perfect. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you. Nothing further, Mr. Harrington.
All right. Well, I appreciate everyone's time. Thank you so much for coming in today. That will conclude the hearing in case number, well, except for the supplemental exhibits, 29227, consolidated with case number 29226.